I never thought my sister's wedding would be the day my entire life changed forever. There I was, a 37-year-old ER nurse who'd saved countless lives hidden behind a stone pillar, like a shameful secret. While hundreds of guests watched my sister marry the perfect man in our dead mother's wedding dress, I sat alone in the shadows, invisible, humiliated exactly where my family wanted me. Then she walked over in that beautiful gown, looked down at me, and whispered with a cold smile, "You should be grateful you were even invited." I should have left. I should have walked away. But then the groom took the microphone. What he said next didn't just stop the wedding. It exposed a lie so devastating, it shattered my sister's perfect fairy tale in front of everyone. And that was only the beginning, because what I discovered over the next 8 weeks, the stolen inheritance, the forged documents, the conspiracy to have me locked away, would turn me from the forgotten sister into the woman who finally learned that the throne was never behind the pillar. It was always within me. This is the story of how I took it back. My name is Megan Davis. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 12 years, I've worked as an ER nurse at Portland General Hospital. Most people would say I have a good life, a steady job, a quiet apartment overlooking the city, the respect of my colleagues. But respect at work doesn't fill the silence when you come home to an empty apartment, and it doesn't heal the wounds left by a family that spent decades making you feel like you didn't matter. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into my mailbox between bills and grocery store flyers. Heavy cardstock, gilded edges, expensive. The kind of wedding invitation that announces not just a celebration, but a statement. Emma Rose Davis and Daniel James Carter request the honour of your presence. My younger sister was getting married, and apparently I'd made the guest list. I should have felt something excitement perhaps, or even happiness for her. Instead, my stomach twisted as I opened the envelope. Inside, tucked beneath the formal invitation, was a small card in Emma's looping handwriting. Try not to embarrass me this time. Not, "I hope you can come," or "I'd love to have you there." Just a reminder that in Emma's eyes, I was a liability, a potential source of embarrassment at her perfect wedding to her perfect man. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment. The memories came flooding back as they always did when anything involved Emma. I remembered the birthday party when I turned 9, the one my parents forgot because they were too busy planning Emma's elaborate 6th birthday celebration 3 months away. I remembered graduating top of my nursing class, calling home with the news, only to have my stepmother Linda cut me off mid-sentence to tell me about Emma's new promotion at the event planning company. I remembered every achievement I'd worked for being met with polite disinterest, while Emma's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like national holidays. And yet through it all, I'd been the reliable one. The one who helped Emma study for exams she couldn't pass on her own. The one who lent her money she never paid back. The one who showed up when she needed something, even though she rarely returned the favour. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn a place in my own family, and all I'd gotten in return was this, a gilded invitation with a note reminding me to stay in my lane. My phone buzzed. Sarah, my best friend, and the closest thing I had to real family, had sent a text. "Did you get it?" I knew the wedding invitation must have reached her mailbox too. She'd been Emma's friend first years ago, before she'd seen through the Golden Girl facade and chosen me instead. I called her. "I got it," I said simply. "Are you going?" Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. She knew my history. She'd held me through enough tears to understand what this invitation represented. "I don't know." The note she included basically told me not to embarrass her. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Maybe this is your chance to finally close that chapter, Meg. Show them you've moved on. Show them you're successful, happy that their opinion doesn't matter anymore." "But what if I haven't moved on?" I whispered. "What if seeing them all together, watching Emma get everything she's always gotten, just reminds me of everything I've never had?" "Then you'll know," Sarah said softly. "And maybe that's what you need, to see them one more time and realise you're better off without them. Either way, the choice is yours. But I think you should go." That night, as I packed my suitcase for the trip home, I found an old photograph tucked in the back of my closet. My mother. My real mother. Sarah, not Linda, who'd replaced her holding me as a baby. I was maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, and she was looking down at me with such absolute love that it made my chest ache. I turned the photo over and saw her handwriting faded, but still legible. My darling girl, never let anyone make you feel invisible. You were born to shine. My hands trembled as I tucked the photograph into my suitcase. I didn't feel like I was born to shine. I felt like I'd spent 37 years learning to disappear. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to face them one last time, not to win their approval, but to prove to myself that I didn't need it anymore. I just had no idea how much that decision would change everything. The house looked exactly the same. 3 hours of driving through rain-soaked Oregon highways, and I'd arrived at the place I'd spent my entire childhood trying to escape, only to find that nothing had changed. The white colonial sat at the end of a tree-lined street, perfectly maintained, the kind of house that looked warm and welcoming from the outside. I knew better. I pulled my car into the driveway behind 2 others I didn't recognise, probably rental cars for out-of-town guests who actually mattered. Before I could even turn off the engine, the front door opened. My stepmother, Linda, stood framed in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between annoyance and resigned tolerance. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched me gather my bags with the same look she might give a door-to-door salesman who'd overstayed their welcome. "Megan," she said flatly as I climbed the porch steps. Not hello. Not welcome home. Just my name delivered like an obligation. "You're late. I told you to be here by 3. I glanced at my phone. It was 3:15. "Traffic was bad coming through Salem," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Well, you're here now." She stepped aside just enough for me to squeeze past her into the foyer. "Put your things in your old room. We're in the middle of preparations, so try not to get in the way." The house smelled like lilies and furniture polish, the scent of preparation for people who mattered. I could hear voices from the living room, the clink of glasses, laughter. Through the doorway, I caught a glimpse of Emma surrounded by bridesmaids in matching robes, all of them looking like they'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. No one looked up when I walked past. I carried my suitcase upstairs to my childhood bedroom, which had long ago been converted into a guest room. The walls that had once been covered in my posters and drawings were now painted a neutral beige. The twin bed had been replaced with a queen, but it was made up with the stiff, uncomfortable sheets reserved for people who weren't expected to stay long. I set my mother's photograph on the nightstand and went back downstairs. Linda and her sister Ruth were in the kitchen, surrounded by clipboards, seating charts, and enough floral arrangements to fill a funeral home. Ruth looked up when I entered. She was a lawyer, something she reminded everyone of constantly, and she had the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who spent her life looking for weaknesses. "Oh, Megan," she said with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Linda said you'd finally arrived. I hope the drive wasn't too taxing." The way she said taxing made it clear she thought I was fragile, delicate someone who couldn't handle basic tasks. I'd learned long ago that correcting these assumptions was pointless. "It was fine," I said simply. "Well, since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful." Linda gestured vaguely toward a collection of mason jars on the counter. "These centerpieces need ribbon tied around them. Emma wants them done by tonight." No please, no would you mind, just the assumption that I existed to serve the same assumption that had coloured every interaction with this family for as long as I could remember. I picked up a spool of ivory ribbon and got to work while Linda and Ruth resumed their conversation about the wedding as if I weren't there. "Daniel's family is contributing $40,000 to the reception," Linda was saying, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Can you imagine? Emma is marrying into serious money. They own half the construction contracts in the state." Emma always did know how to land on her feet, Ruth replied, not like some people who are content with mediocrity. I didn't have to look up to know that comment was aimed at me. Nursing in their eyes was a working-class profession, something people did when they couldn't achieve anything better. Never mind that I'd spent over a decade saving lives. Never mind that I'd graduated at the top of my class despite working 2 jobs to pay for school. In this house, I would always be the disappointing daughter who'd failed to live up to some impossible standard I'd never been told about. I spent the next 3 hours tying ribbons, arranging flowers in vases, carrying boxes from the garage to the backyard, where the rehearsal dinner would be held tomorrow night. No one thanked me. No one asked if I needed a break or something to drink. I was furniture that happened to have useful hands. It was nearly 7 in the evening when Emma finally appeared floating down the stairs in a cloud of white fabric. "Mum, I need you to look at the dress one more time. I think the hem might need another adjustment." I followed them upstairs to Emma's room, her actual childhood room, which had been preserved like a shrine where a dressmaker was waiting with pins and measuring tape. Emma stepped onto a small platform in front of a full-length mirror, and the dressmaker carefully lifted the dress over her head. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that dress. I'd seen it in photographs locked away in albums Linda had tried to hide from me. The delicate lace sleeves, the pearl buttons down the back, the way the silk fell in soft waves from the waist. "Is that?" I started to say, but my voice cracked. Emma frowned at her reflection, oblivious. "Do you think the waist is too tight?" "It feels tight." A storage box sat open on Emma's bed, tissue paper spilling out. As the dressmaker fussed with the hem, something slipped from the box and fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up before I could think better of it. It was a photograph. My father younger than I'd ever seen him standing beside a woman in a wedding dress. My mother, wearing the exact dress Emma was now modelling in front of the mirror. My hands went numb. "Emma, where did you get this dress?" She glanced at me, annoyed at the interruption. "What? Oh, Mum had it altered for me. Why?" Before I could answer, Linda appeared in the doorway. She took one look at the photograph in my hand and her expression hardened. "It was just sitting in storage, Megan. No point wasting a perfectly good dress." Wasting... The word came out sharper than I intended. This was my mother's wedding dress. "It was a dress that no one was using," Linda said coldly. "Emma is part of this family. She has every right to wear it." Emma had gone very still, staring at herself in the mirror with new eyes. "Wait, this was your mum's dress, Linda. You said it was from a boutique you'd been saving." "Does it matter?" Linda cut her off. "It's beautiful. It fits you perfectly, and it would have been rotting in a closet otherwise. Megan certainly wasn't going to use it." The cruelty of that statement, the casual dismissal of my mother's memory, the assumption that I'd never have a wedding of my own, the fact that they'd taken this too without asking, settled over me like a physical weight. I looked at Emma, waiting for her to say something to object, to recognise how wrong this was. But Emma just turned back to the mirror, smoothing the silk over her hips. "It is really beautiful," she said softly. Then, to the dressmaker, "Can you take it in 1/2 inch at the waist?" I set the photograph down carefully on the dresser and left the room. Behind me, I heard Aunt Ruth's voice from the hallway. "Megan, don't you dare make a scene like you always do. This is Emma's week, and you will not ruin it with your dramatics." I kept walking until I reached the bottom of the stairs, where Ruth caught up with me, her hand closing around my elbow. Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "You need to keep yourself in check this weekend. Emma's marrying into a very important family, and we don't need you creating problems. Understand?" I pulled my arm away. "I haven't done anything." "Yet." Ruth's eyes were ice. "But we all know how you can be. Emotional, unstable, always playing the victim." She glanced back up the stairs, then leaned closer. "You're lucky we even let you come back here. That girl up there is her mother's ghost, and we both know how Linda feels about ghosts." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone in the foyer of a house that had never been a home, wearing my dead mother's face in a family that resented me for it. That night I couldn't sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, but that wasn't what kept me awake. It was the weight of everything unsaid, everything taken, everything I'd lost without ever knowing I'd had it in the first place. Around midnight, I got up and opened the closet, thinking maybe I'd find some remnant of my childhood that hadn't been erased. Instead, I found a small cardboard box shoved into the back corner underneath a pile of old linens. Inside was a leather-bound book I recognized immediately, my mother's diary. My hand shook as I opened it, flipping through pages of her handwriting, her thoughts, her life before cancer took her from me. The last entry was dated 3 days before she died. The handwriting was shaky but still legible. If anything happens to me, please make sure Megan knows about the fund I set up for her education. Don't let them. The rest of the page had been torn out, just ripped away, leaving jagged edges and the ghost of words I would never read. I sat on the floor of that closet, holding my mother's diary, and realised that whatever had been taken from me went far deeper than a wedding dress. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Riverside Estate, the kind of venue that required a second mortgage to book. I'd driven myself there, following the line of luxury cars up the winding driveway, feeling distinctly out of place in my practical Honda among the Mercedes and Teslas. The estate overlooked the Willamette River, all glass walls and Edison bulbs strung between trees, the kind of effortless elegance that cost a fortune to achieve. I was directed to table 12. Not table 1, where Emma and Daniel held court with the wedding party. Not even table 5 or 6, where the important relatives sat. Table 12 was tucked in the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a decorative column, close enough to technically be part of the event, but far enough away to be forgotten. My table mates were distant cousins I'd met maybe twice in my life, people who'd driven in from somewhere in Idaho and seemed confused about why they'd been invited at all. They introduced themselves politely enough, but within minutes they'd turned their chairs inward to talk among themselves, creating a small circle that didn't include me. I could have been a mannequin placed there to fill the empty seat. From my corner, I watched Emma work the room like she'd been born to it. She wore a cream silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair swept up in an artfully casual style that I knew had taken hours to perfect. She moved from table to table with Daniel at her side, accepting congratulations and well wishes like a queen receiving tribute. Daniel was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way, tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that seemed genuine. He kept his hand on the small of Emma's back, attentive and devoted. I told myself I wasn't jealous. I'd made my peace with being the overlooked sister years ago. But watching Emma bask in that kind of love and attention, knowing she was wearing our mother's dress and probably sleeping in a bed paid for with money meant for me, it made something bitter rise in my throat. Halfway through the salad course, I noticed Daniel looking in my direction. Not at Emma, who was laughing with her bridesmaids. At me. When our eyes met, he excused himself from the head table and started walking toward me. My table mates, who'd been ignoring me completely, suddenly sat up straighter, clearly impressed that the groom himself was approaching. "Megan, right?" he said, extending his hand. "We haven't been properly introduced. I'm Daniel." "I know who you are," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Congratulations." "Thanks. Mind if I sit for a minute?" My face hurts from smiling. He pulled out the empty chair beside me without waiting for an answer, and I noticed Emma watching from across the room, her smile frozen in place. "Your sister tells me you're a nurse," Daniel said. "ER, right?" "That's right, Portland General." "That must be intense work." He seemed genuinely interested, leaning forward slightly. "I can't imagine dealing with that kind of pressure every day." I shrugged. "You get used to it, though some days are harder than others." "I bet. Do you ever have to deal with accident victims, car crashes, that kind of thing?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes. We get a lot of trauma cases." Why do you ask? Daniel's expression shifted, becoming more serious. I was in a bad car accident last year. Worst night of my life. My car flipped on Highway 26 during a rainstorm. I was trapped, bleeding, and I honestly thought I was going to die out there. He paused, his eyes distant, clearly reliving the memory. But someone stopped. A woman. She climbed through the wreckage to reach me, held pressure on my wounds, kept me conscious until the paramedics arrived. I never got her name. She left before I could thank her. My heart began to beat faster. Highway 26. A year ago. I remembered that night, the rain, the overturned car, the man trapped inside, who'd lost so much blood I wasn't sure he'd make it. I'd been driving home from a double shift, exhausted, but when I saw the accident, there was never a question of whether to stop. That was just what you did. She saved my life, Daniel continued, and I've spent the last year wishing I could find her and tell her what that meant. Before I could process what he was saying, before I could decide whether to tell him the truth, Emma appeared beside us like a heat-seeking missile. She slid her hand onto Daniel's shoulder, her smile bright and possessive. There you are, honey. We're about to do the toasts. You can talk to Megan later. She laughed, but there was steel underneath it. Enough work talk, anyway. This is supposed to be fun, remember? Daniel stood reluctantly, giving me an apologetic look. Of course. Sorry, I didn't mean to monopolise your time, Megan. As they walked away, Emma leaned in close to him, whispering something I couldn't hear. But I saw the way she glanced back at me, her eyes cold, despite her smile. The toasts began, each one more effusive than the last. Emma's maid of honour talked about how Emma always got what she wanted because she deserved it. Daniel's best man joked about how lucky Daniel was to land such a catch. Linda stood and gave a speech about watching Emma grow into a beautiful, accomplished woman, never once mentioning that she had another daughter in the room. When Linda's eyes swept past table 12, they didn't even pause. But it was Emma's speech that cut the deepest. She stood with a champagne glass in hand, radiant in the candlelight, and began thanking everyone who'd made the wedding possible. She thanked her bridesmaids, she thanked Daniel's parents, she thanked the wedding planner. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "And, of course, my sister Megan is here. She's always preferred staying in the background, being comfortable that way, so I'm sure she doesn't mind that I haven't mentioned her much. That's just how she is." The words landed like stones. A few people glanced my way with pity or confusion. Most didn't bother looking at all. Emma had just told a room full of people that I was the kind of person who preferred to be forgotten, who was most comfortable being invisible. And she'd done it with a smile, making it sound like she was being considerate of my supposed preferences, rather than actively diminishing me. I made it through the rest of dinner on autopilot, barely tasting the food, barely hearing the conversations around me. When the evening finally ended and people began filtering toward their cars, I grabbed my purse and headed for the parking lot, desperate to escape. I was halfway to my car when I heard Daniel's voice behind me. "Megan, wait." I turned. He was walking toward me alone, his tie loosened, looking uncomfortable. "I just wanted to say you're nothing, like Emma described." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She said you were different, kind of difficult, that you had trouble connecting with people." He shook his head. "But you don't seem like that at all. You seem kind, genuine. I don't know, maybe I'm overstepping, but something doesn't add up." There was confusion in his eyes, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together were starting to bother him. I wanted to tell him everything about the diary, about the dress, about the years of being erased from my own family's story. But this was his wedding weekend, and he was marrying my sister tomorrow. Whatever suspicions he had, they weren't my responsibility to confirm. "Thanks for saying that," I said quietly. "I hope you and Emma are very happy together." I turned and walked to my car before he could say anything else. As I reached for my door handle, I heard voices coming from the garden path that ran along the side of the building. I recognised Emma's laugh immediately, followed by her voice lower and more serious. Don't worry, Ruth. She won't figure anything out. By the time this weekend is over, Megan will be so humiliated she'll never show her face again. I froze, my hand still on the door handle, straining to hear more. You're sure? That was Aunt Ruth's voice. She seemed pretty curious about the dress. Please, Megan's too pathetic to do anything about it. She never has, and she never will. Tomorrow, she'll sit in whatever corner we put her in, and then she'll go back to her sad little life. Trust me, by the time I'm done, she'll never want to see this family again. They both laughed, and the sound of their footsteps faded as they walked back toward the main building. I stood in the dark parking lot, my mother's words echoing in my mind. Never let anyone make you feel invisible. You were born to shine. But as I drove away from the Riverside estate, all I could think was that maybe some people were meant to stay in the shadows. Maybe that was where I belonged after all. I just didn't know yet how wrong I was. The church was already packed when I arrived. St. Michael's was one of those grand old churches, with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast coloured light across the pews, the kind of place that made every wedding feel like a royal occasion. I'd worn my best dress, a simple navy blue that Sarah had helped me pick out, and I'd spent an hour on my hair and makeup determined to look put together, even if I felt like I was falling apart inside. I showed the usher my invitation, and he gestured vaguely toward the back. The first few rows were marked with the reserved signs for immediate family, though I noticed Linda had made no such reservation for me. I found a seat about halfway back on the bride's side and tried to make myself as small as possible. Around me, guests were arriving in waves, air-kissing and exclaiming over each other's outfits. I recognised some faces from yesterday's rehearsal dinner, but no one acknowledged me. I might as well have been part of the furniture. Through the tall windows, I could see photographers setting up outside, ready to capture every moment of Emma's perfect day. The organ music swelled, signalling that the ceremony was about to begin. People were finding their seats, the excited chatter building to a crescendo. I was just settling in, preparing to endure the next hour with whatever dignity I could muster when a woman in a black suit approached me. She had a clipboard and the efficient, no-nonsense manner of a professional coordinator. "Excuse me, are you Megan Davis?" My stomach dropped. "Yes. We've had a last-minute seating change. Would you mind following me?" I wanted to ask why to demand an explanation, but the ceremony was about to start and people were staring. I gathered my small purse and followed her down the side aisle, assuming she was moving me closer to the front, some last-minute acknowledgement that I was in fact the bride's sister. Instead, she led me to the very back of the church past the last row of pews, to a spot I hadn't even noticed before. Behind one of the massive stone pillars that supported the church's architecture, someone had placed a single folding chair. "If you could just sit here, that would be perfect," the coordinator said with a practiced smile. "Thank you for being flexible." I stared at the chair, then at the pillar, then back at her. "You want me to sit behind a pillar?" "It's just for the ceremony. We had more guests than expected and needed to make room." She was already walking away, her heels clicking on the stone floor, leaving me standing there with the folding chair and the slowly dawning realization of what was happening. I could have refused. I could have walked out right then. But the organ music was shifting to the processional, and guests were turning in their seats, and the thought of making a scene, of proving Emma right that I was dramatic and attention-seeking, kept me frozen in place. So I sat down on that folding chair behind the pillar, hidden from view of the altar, and felt something inside me break. From where I sat, I could hear everything but see almost nothing. The rustle of fabric as the wedding party processed down the aisle. The collective gasp when Emma appeared. The minister's voice welcoming everyone to this joyous occasion. But all I could see was stone and shadow and the backs of the last row of pews. Guests walking past to use the restroom did double takes when they saw me sitting there. An elderly woman in a purple hat stopped and whispered loudly to the usher, "Why is someone sitting back there? Is she a crasher?" The usher hurried her along without answering, but not before I caught the pitying look she gave me. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, trying not to exist, trying to be as invisible as they'd always wanted me to be. The ceremony droned on words about love and commitment, echoing off the vaulted ceiling, and I wondered what my mother would think if she could see this, her daughter hidden in the shadows while her other daughter wore her wedding dress and married a man who seemed genuinely kind. Then I heard footsteps approaching lighter than the others, the rustle of silk. I looked up and saw Emma standing there in my mother's dress, radiant and terrible, looking down at me with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then leaned down, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should be grateful you were even invited. Don't make a scene." She smiled, then cold and triumphant, and glided away to join her groom at the altar, leaving me sitting in the darkness behind the pillar, like a secret too shameful to acknowledge. I heard the minister ask if anyone objected to the union. Silence. I heard Emma and Daniel exchange their vows, their voices carrying clearly, even though I couldn't see their faces. I heard the minister pronounce them husband and wife, heard the applause, heard the recessional music begin. And through it all, I sat in my folding chair behind the stone pillar and wondered how I'd let my life become this small. But then, something changed. The recessional music faded, and instead of the usual organised exit, there was a strange pause, murmuring from the congregation. Someone cleared their throat over the microphone. Before everyone heads to the reception, Daniel's voice rang out, amplified through the church's sound system. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for coming. Standard groom speech, I thought. I started to gather my purse ready to slip out before the crowds could witness my humiliation in the light of day. But Daniel's voice continued, and something in his tone made me freeze. Actually, there's something that's been bothering me, a question I need to ask. I could hear the confusion in the silence that followed. This wasn't part of the program. "Why?" Daniel said, and I could hear him moving, his footsteps echoing as he walked away from the altar. "Is Megan Davis sitting behind a pillar?" The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what was happening. Because Daniel Carter, the groom, the man who just married my sister, had just asked the entire church why I was hidden in the shadows. And from the shocked silence that followed, I knew that no one, least of all Emma, had an answer he was going to accept. I couldn't see Daniel's face, but I could hear his footsteps moving away from the altar, the microphone picking up each deliberate step. The church had gone so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Guests were twisting in their pews, trying to locate me in my hidden corner. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, but Daniel's question had turned a spotlight on the one thing Emma had tried so hard to keep in shadow. "I'm serious." Daniel continued, his voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before, something harder, more determined. "I need someone to explain to me why my new wife's sister is sitting alone behind a pillar while we celebrate. Because from where I'm standing, that seems intentional and cruel." I heard Linda's voice sharp with panic, though she was trying to maintain composure. "Daniel, this is hardly appropriate. This is your wedding day, not the time for what?" Daniel cut her off. "Not the time for honesty. Not the time to question why someone would hide a member of their own family like a shameful secret." The microphone amplified every word, and I could hear the gasps spreading through the congregation like ripples in water. I pressed myself further back in my chair, wishing I could vanish entirely. "Let me tell you all a story," Daniel said, and something in his tone made it clear he wasn't asking permission anymore. "1 year ago, I was driving home from a construction site during a rainstorm. Highway 26, just past the Sylvan exit. The roads were slick, visibility was terrible, and I took a curve too fast. My truck flipped 3 times before landing upside down in a ditch. I felt my blood run cold. Highway 26, a year ago. The memory came rushing back, the rain hammering my windshield, the crumpled truck in the ravine, the man trapped inside bleeding from a head wound and a gash across his chest. I was trapped." Daniel continued, his voice rougher now. The seatbelt was crushing my chest, there was glass everywhere, and I could feel blood running down my face. I couldn't get my phone, couldn't reach the door, and I was losing consciousness fast. I remember thinking this was it. I was going to die alone on a dark highway, and no one would find me until morning. The church was absolutely silent now. Even the rustling of fabric had stopped. But then someone stopped. A car pulled over, and I heard a woman's voice calling through the broken window. She told me her name was Megan, and that she was a nurse. She crawled through the wreckage to reach me. I remember her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She held pressure on the wounds to stop the bleeding. She kept talking to me, asking me questions to keep me conscious. "What's your name? What day is it? Stay with me, Daniel. Help is coming. Just stay with me." I closed my eyes, transported back to that night. I'd been exhausted from a double shift, barely staying awake on the drive home. But the moment I saw that overturned truck, training had kicked in. I'd grabbed my emergency kit from the trunk and slid down the muddy embankment without thinking about my own safety. "She stayed with me until the paramedics arrived," Daniel said, and when they tried to thank her to get her information, she just said she was glad I was okay and she left. No name, no way to contact her. For months I tried to find her. I wanted to thank her, to tell her that she'd saved my life. I heard Emma's voice, then high and strained. "Daniel, sweetheart, maybe we should—" I'm not finished. The edge in Daniel's voice was unmistakable now. For months I searched. I asked the hospital if they had any record of a nurse named Megan who'd been on duty that night. Nothing. I posted in local Facebook groups. Nothing. And then I met Emma. She worked for the event company that handled my corporate functions. She was beautiful, charming, and she seemed to understand what I'd been through. He paused and I could hear him moving again, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Because Emma told me she was there that night. She told me she was the one who saved me. The gasps were louder now, shocked and disbelieving. I heard someone say no under their breath. "I had a head injury," Daniel continued. "A concussion. My memories of that night were fragmented, confused. I remembered a woman's voice, her hand stopping the bleeding, but the face was blurry. So when Emma told me it was her, when she showed me photos she'd taken at the hospital, when she described holding my hand while I was unconscious, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Who would lie about something like that?" My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of the folding chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Emma had claimed she saved Daniel. She'd built their entire relationship on a lie. "But last night," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly, "at the rehearsal dinner, I sat down with Megan. We talked about her work. She mentioned dealing with trauma cases and something about the way she described triage, the way she talked about keeping accident victims conscious. It was like a key turning in a lock. The voice, the calm authority, the gentleness underneath the professionalism. It was her. It was always her." I could hear Emma now, her voice rising in pitch. "Daniel, you're confused. You said yourself your memories were fuzzy. You're embarrassing everyone." "The only person who should be embarrassed is you." Daniel's voice was steel now. "Because this morning I called the paramedics who responded that night. I got their report. And do you know what it said? It said a female nurse named Megan had already stabilized the patient when they arrived. She'd logged her nursing license number for liability purposes. Megan Davis, RN. The report was dated at 8:47 p.m. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "And do you know when you showed up, Emma, according to the hospital security footage my lawyer obtained this morning, you arrived at the hospital at 9:52 p.m., more than an hour later. You weren't there when I needed help. You were never there, but you took photos next to my hospital bed, and you lied to me for an entire year." The church erupted. Voices rose in shock and confusion. I heard Linda trying to speak Aunt Ruth's sharp interjection, other guests murmuring in disbelief. But through it all, I heard Daniel's footsteps, again, walking toward the back of the church, toward the pillar where I sat frozen. And then he was there, standing in front of me, still holding the microphone, his expression a mixture of gratitude and anguish and rage that wasn't directed at me at all. "Megan," he said quietly, though the microphone picked up every word, "you saved my life, and instead of being celebrated, you're hidden behind a pillar at a wedding built on a lie." He turned back toward the altar, toward Emma, who stood in my mother's dress with her face drained of all colour. "Emma, you arrived 10 minutes after the ambulance. You took selfies next to my hospital bed. You told my family, my friends, everyone who would listen, that you saved me. And then you let me marry you, knowing that everything between us was based on a lie." His voice broke on the last word, and in that break I heard the death of whatever love he'd thought he felt for my sister. "Why?" he asked, the microphone trembling in his hand. "Why would you do that?" The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. I could see Emma through the gap beside the pillar. Now she stood frozen at the altar in my mother's dress, her face a mask of panic barely concealed behind trembling lips. The bouquet shook in her hands. Daniel turned back toward the congregation, his voice steady despite the emotion I could hear underneath. "Let me be very clear about what happened that night, because I've spent the morning getting the full story. When Megan found me, I was in bad shape. Compound fracture in my left arm, deep laceration across my chest, head trauma. I was going into shock." He looked down at me, and I saw something in his eyes, not pity but recognition, respect. She didn't hesitate. According to the paramedic report, she'd climbed down a steep embankment in the rain, ruined her jacket, using it to pad the broken glass so she could reach me safely, and had already established pressure points to control the bleeding by the time emergency services arrived. She'd kept me conscious by talking to me, asking me questions, making me focus on her voice instead of the pain. I remembered his face that night, pale and scared, blood mixing with rain. I remembered telling him about my day at the hospital, about a patient who'd brought her therapy dog, to thank the staff, anything to keep him focused on something other than dying. I remembered the paramedics arriving and trying to get my information, but I'd just told them I was a nurse I'd happened to be driving by and I needed to get home. I hadn't wanted recognition, I just wanted him to live. "She saved my life," Daniel said simply. And when the paramedics asked for her name, she said, and I quote from their report, "I was just doing my job. Make sure he gets to trauma quickly." And then she left. No name, no contact information, just disappeared into the rain. Emma found her voice, then high and desperate. "Daniel, you're confused. You had a head injury, you said so yourself. Your memories from that night aren't reliable." "You're right," Daniel cut her off. "My memories weren't reliable, which is why you were able to lie to me so easily." He pulled his phone from his pocket, held it up. "But hospital security footage doesn't lie. Neither do time-stamped photographs. Neither do phone records." Aunt Ruth stood up abruptly from her seat in the second row. "This is slander, Daniel. I'm an attorney, and I'm warning you that making false accusations in front of witnesses—" "Sit down, Ruth." The command came from an elderly man in the third row, someone I vaguely recognized as a friend of my father's. Let the man finish speaking. Daniel nodded at the older man gratefully, then turned back to Emma. "You knew who I was before the accident, didn't you?" Emma's face went from pale to ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You worked for Cascade Events. You handled several of my corporate functions over the previous year. You knew I was single, knew I owned a successful business, knew I'd be a good catch." His voice was cold now, clinical. "And when you heard about my accident because you had a scanner app on your phone, I found it yesterday. You drove to the scene. But by the time you got there, Megan was already leaving, and the ambulance was already loading me in. So you couldn't claim you saved me at the scene, but you followed the ambulance to the hospital. You waited until I was out of surgery and unconscious, and then you took photos next to my bed and told everyone who would listen that you were the hero." "That's not true." Emma's voice cracked. "Daniel, please. You're not thinking clearly. Megan has always been jealous of me, always wanted what I had. Stop. The word came out like a whip crack. Stop lying. I have the evidence, Emma. I have your Instagram post from that night time stamped at 10:15 p.m. showing you at the hospital with the caption, "So grateful I could be there for him." I have text messages you sent to friends saying you saved someone's life. I have the security footage showing you arriving at the hospital an hour after I did, looking perfectly put together, not a hair out of place. You weren't there when I needed help. You were never there. The church erupted in whispers. I could hear people pulling out their phones, probably looking up Emma's old social media posts. A woman near the front said loudly, "Is this true? Did she really lie about saving him?" Emma's bridesmaids were backing away from her now, their expression shifting from supportive to uncertain. Linda tried to reach for Emma's arm, but Emma shook her off violently. "You don't understand," Emma said, her voice rising. "I built a relationship with you. I made you happy. Does it really matter how it started?" "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "It matters. Because everything between us has been based on a lie. Every time you told that story at parties, every time you let my parents thank you for saving their son, every time you accepted praise for something you didn't do, you were stealing from Megan. And worse, you made sure she'd never know. You hid her at this wedding. You've spent years making sure she stayed invisible so she could never contradict your story." I couldn't take it anymore. The attention, the revelation, the way the entire church was staring at the space around the pillar, trying to see me, it was too much. I stood up, my legs shaky, and tried to slip past Daniel toward the side exit. But Emma saw me moving, and something in her snapped. "Don't you dare walk away! Walk!" Her scream echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and the raw hatred in it froze everyone in place. "You've ruined everything. You've always ruined everything. This was supposed to be my day, my wedding, my perfect life. But no, you had to be there that night. You had to play hero. You had to..." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she'd just admitted. The church was utterly silent. Even Linda and Aunt Ruth had gone still, their faces reflecting the horror of watching Emma's mask completely shatter. Emma looked around at the sea of shocked faces, at Daniel standing with his arms crossed, at me frozen in the aisle. And then she looked down at the wedding dress, my mother's dress, and something seemed to break inside her. Her shoulders started to shake, and I couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying or both. "You don't understand," she whispered into the microphone that was still live at the altar. "You'll never understand what it's like to be compared to a ghost." For a moment, Emma's whispered confession hung in the air, raw and strange. But before anyone could process what she meant about being compared to a ghost, she crumpled. Her knees buckled and she collapsed into a heap of white silk and lace, her sobs echoing through the church with theatrical precision. Linda was at her side instantly, gathering Emma into her arms like a wounded child. "Someone get water. Can't you see she's in shock?" Aunt Ruth materialized on Emma's other side, shooting Daniel a look of pure venom, before turning her attention to the crowd. "This is what happens," Ruth announced, her lawyer voice cutting through the murmurs, "when someone unstable is allowed to disrupt a sacred ceremony. We've tried for years to help Megan, to support her through her issues, but she's always resented Emma's success." I stood frozen in the aisle watching this performance unfold. Emma was crying into Linda's shoulder, her whole body shaking, and I could see guests' expressions shifting. Some of them were looking at me now with suspicion instead of sympathy. This was what Emma did best. She turned her own cruelty into victimhood so seamlessly that people forgot who'd been hurt in the first place. She couldn't stand that I was happy. Emma's voice rose in a wail. "She's trying to steal my husband on my wedding day. She's always wanted everything I had." A middle-aged woman I didn't recognize stood up from a pew near the front. "This is disgraceful. That poor girl planned a beautiful wedding and her own sister is sabotaging it." Several people murmured in agreement. But then I heard another voice, older and firmer. "Now, hold on, just a minute." It was the elderly man who told Ruth to sit down earlier. "That boy just presented evidence. Hospital records, security footage. Are we supposed to ignore that?" "She probably fabricated it," Ruth shot back. "Megan has always been manipulative. We have documentation of her psychological issues going back years. Paranoid delusions, jealousy, and inability to accept reality." "That's not true," I heard myself say, but my voice came out weak, barely audible over the chaos. Linda stood up, still supporting Emma, her face a mask of wounded dignity. "We didn't want to air family business like this, but Megan has struggled with stability since she was young. We've tried to protect her privacy, but clearly she needs more help than we can provide." I watched them build the narrative in real time, 3 decades of my life, reduced to a convenient fiction about mental instability. And the terrible thing was, some people were believing it. I could see it in their faces, the way they were looking at me now, not with sympathy for the woman who'd been hidden behind a pillar, but with wary concern for the unstable woman who might be delusional. The church had divided into factions. Younger guests had their phones out, some filming, others texting frantically. I saw a few older women who looked uncomfortable, including one who kept glancing at me with something like recognition. Maybe she remembered my mother. Sarah remembered a time before Linda rewrote our family history. But they stayed silent, unwilling to contradict Linda's version of events in such a public setting. Emma's bridesmaids surrounded her now, forming a protective circle, shooting me accusatory glares. One of them, a blonde in a lavender dress, said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I always thought there was something off about her sister." I felt the walls closing in. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. I couldn't do this, couldn't stand here while they painted me as the villain in a story where I'd done nothing but try to save a man's life and attend my sister's wedding. Daniel was saying something, trying to talk over the chaos, but I couldn't hear him anymore over the roaring in my ears. So I did the only thing I could do. I turned and walked toward the exit with my head high, even though my legs were shaking and my vision was blurring with tears. I refused to let fall. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Megan, wait." I heard Daniel call after me, but I kept walking. Past the pillars, past the pews, past the guests who stared at me with judgment or pity or curiosity, past the coordinator who'd seated me in the shadows in the first place. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's and stepped out into air that had grown thick with the promise of rain. The sky had darkened while we were inside, clouds rolling in heavy and grey. The first drops began to fall as I walked down the church steps, and within seconds it became a downpour, soaking through my carefully chosen dress, washing away the makeup I'd spent an hour applying. But I welcomed it. The rain gave me permission to cry, disguised my tears, as just more water running down my face. I stood there on the sidewalk, shaking from cold and adrenaline, and the aftermath of watching my entire family collaborate to gaslight a church full of people. I'd come here hoping to prove I'd moved past their rejection, hoping to sit through one ceremony with dignity and then leave forever. Instead, I'd been exposed, in the worst possible way, turned into a spectacle, and then villainized for the crime of existing. I heard the church doors bang open behind me, followed by running footsteps. I didn't turn around. I couldn't face more accusations, more manipulation, more of Emma's theatrical tears. But then I heard Daniel's voice, breathless and urgent. "Megan, wait, please." I stopped walking but didn't turn around. The rain was coming down harder now, plastering my hair to my face, turning the sidewalk into a river. Daniel came around to face me, still in his tuxedo, water streaming down his face. He looked like he'd run through the crowd to get to me. "I believe you," he said simply. "I believe every word you said. Every word you didn't say. It doesn't matter." My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "They've already decided who to believe. Then we'll prove them wrong." His eyes were fierce, determined. "Because if Emma lied about this, if she built our entire relationship on stealing your act of kindness, then what else has she been lying about? What else have they all been lying about? I looked at him. This man who was supposed to be my brother-in-law who'd just blown up his own wedding to tell the truth. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Because you saved my life, he said, and because nobody deserves to be treated the way they just treated you. Nobody. He wiped rain from his face. Let me help you. Let me help you find out what else they've been hiding, because I guarantee you, Megan, people who lie about something this big don't stop at just one lie. Thunder rumbled overhead, and I stood there in the rain looking at this stranger who'd somehow become the first person in my family to actually see me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel quite so alone. Okay, I whispered. Okay. We stood there in the downpour, two people who should have been strangers but were now connected by a thread of truth that had just unraveled an entire wedding. Daniel's tuxedo was ruined, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck, and I realised he'd probably spent $30,000 on a ceremony that had just imploded in front of 300 witnesses. Yet here he was standing in the rain with me, instead of trying to salvage whatever remained inside that church. I'm so sorry, he said, and the rawness in his voice made me look up at him. I should have recognised you sooner. The moment you started talking about your work at the rehearsal dinner, something felt familiar, but I pushed it away. I told myself I was imagining things because Emma had told me so many times that her sister was difficult, jealous, someone who created problems. He shook his head, water streaming down his face. I feel like I've been living in a fog for a year, like I've been dating a character Emma created instead of a real person. You couldn't have known, I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of rain hitting pavement. She's very good at lying. She's had 30 years of practice. That's not an excuse. Daniel's jaw tightened. I should have questioned it. There were so many inconsistencies that the way she told the story changed depending on who was listening. Sometimes she said she pulled me from the car. Other times she said the paramedics did that part. Sometimes she said she held my hand in the ambulance, but the paramedic report I got this morning says she wasn't in the ambulance at all. He ran a hand through his wet hair. I was so grateful to her, or to who I thought she was, that I didn't want to see the holes in her story. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop shaking from the cold. It doesn't matter now. Everyone in there thinks I'm the liar. They think I'm mentally unstable, that I'm jealous of my sister, that I'm trying to ruin her life. The words came out bitter. Which is exactly what they've always thought. This just gave them an excuse to say it out loud. I don't need their pity, Daniel. My voice cracked and I had to force myself to breathe. I just wanted to be seen as a person. Not a problem, not an embarrassment, not someone who needed to be hidden behind a pillar, so I wouldn't spoil the aesthetic of Emma's perfect day. I've spent 37 years being invisible in my own family, and I'm so tired. I'm so tired of trying to earn a place at a table that was never set for me. The rain was letting up slightly, turning from a downpour to a steady drum. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more determined. I've had doubts for months, he admitted, small things that didn't add up. Emma would tell me she was working late, but when I'd surprise her at the office, she wouldn't be there. She'd talk about her childhood, but the stories changed. Sometimes she was close with you, sometimes you didn't exist at all in her telling. She'd get angry when I asked about your mother, said it was too painful to discuss. But then I'd catch her wearing jewellery, she said, belonged to Linda's mother, and the style would be from a different era entirely. He looked back at the church where I could see the shadows moving behind the stained glass windows. I was too scared to see it, scared that if I pulled one thread, the whole thing would unravel. And I'd have to admit, I'd spent a year building a life with someone I didn't actually know. He turned back to me. But now I do see it, and I'm not marrying her. That ceremony never finished. We were interrupted before the minister could pronounce us married, and we never signed the license. Legally, we're not husband and wife, and we never will be. Your family will hate you for this, I said quietly. She'll tell everyone you abandoned her, humiliated her. Let her. There was steel in his voice now. I'd rather be alone than build a marriage on lies. And besides, he stepped closer, his expression intense. If Emma lied about saving me and your family, backed her up, helped her maintain that lie for a year, what else are they hiding? What else have they done to you? The question hung in the air between us, and I thought about the torn diary page, the wedding dress, the 30 years of being overlooked and dismissed and erased. I don't know, I whispered, but I found something last night, my mother's diary. The last entry mentioned a fund she set up for my education, but the page was torn out before she could finish writing about it. Daniel's eyes sharpened. A fund? Did you ever receive any educational funding? No, I paid for nursing school myself. Student loans I'm still paying off. Then, where did that money go? He pulled out his phone, ignoring the water droplets on the screen. I have a friend who's a forensic accountant. If there was a fund in your name, we can trace it. We can find out what happened to it. He looked up at me. Let me help you, Megan. Let's find out what else they've taken from you. What else they've hidden. I wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that someone would finally help me uncover the truth. But I'd spent my whole life learning that the people who promised to support you were usually the ones who hurt you worst. Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything just because I did my job that night. Because you saved my life when you didn't have to, he said simply. And because nobody deserves to be treated the way they just treated you. And maybe... He hesitated, then continued. Maybe because I need to know the truth too. About who I almost married. About what kind of family I almost joined. I looked at this man, this stranger, who'd somehow become my unlikely ally, and felt something shift inside me. For 37 years, I'd accepted my role as the forgotten daughter, the invisible sister. I'd convinced myself that staying quiet was the same as being strong. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe it was time to stop accepting the crumbs they threw me and start demanding answers. Okay, I said, my voice steadier now. Let's find out what they're hiding. Daniel smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since this whole disaster began. He was about to say something else when my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out the screen, spotted with raindrops, and saw a text from an unknown number. The message was short and chilling. You should have stayed quiet. Now you'll regret it. We have everything we need to destroy you. I showed the screen to Daniel, and I watched his expression harden into something that looked almost dangerous. Then they just declared war, he said quietly, and they have no idea who they're dealing with. Neither did I, but I was about to find out. 3 days after the wedding, I returned to work. I hadn't wanted to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that church full of people staring at me, heard Emma's scream echoing off the vaulted ceiling, felt the weight of being seen in the worst possible way after spending 37 years trying to be invisible. But Sarah had gently insisted that staying in her guest room replaying the disaster in my head wasn't helping anyone, least of all me. So I drove to Portland General for my night shift, parked in my usual spot, and walked through the familiar ER entrance, hoping that being back in the one place I'd always felt competent would somehow make me feel whole again. It didn't. If anything, the fluorescent lights felt too bright, the familiar sounds too loud. I jumped when a gurney rattled past. I flinched when someone called my name. My hand shook as I checked the assignment board. Megan! My supervisor, Patricia, appeared at my elbow. You okay to be here? I heard about what happened at your sister's wedding. If you need more time. I'm fine, I said automatically, the lie I'd been telling my whole life. I'd rather be working. She studied me with the kind of practiced assessment that came from 20 years in emergency medicine, but she didn't push. Room 407, overnight observation. Elderly patient, stable vitals, just needs monitoring. Should be a quiet night. I nodded and headed for the elevators, grateful for an easy assignment. I couldn't handle trauma cases tonight, couldn't be the calm voice keeping someone conscious while their life hung in the balance. I needed simple, I needed routine. I needed to remember who I was before everything fell apart. Mrs. Chen was 83 years old, according to her chart admitted for dehydration and malnutrition. She'd been found by a neighbour after 3 days alone in her apartment. The notes mentioned she had 2 adult children in the area, but neither had visited during her hospital stay. When I entered her room to check her vitals, she was awake, staring at the ceiling with the particular emptiness I'd seen before in patients who'd been forgotten by the people who should have cared most. "Good evening, Mrs. Chen. I'm Megan. I'll be your nurse tonight." I kept my voice gentle as I approached her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Old," she said with a slight smile. "Useless. The usual." I checked her IV. Her blood pressure made notes on her chart. Everything was stable, improving even. She'd be discharged in a day or 2, sent back to that empty apartment, unless social services could arrange something better. I'd seen this pattern too many times: elderly people who'd raised children, worked jobs, built lives only to end up alone because their families were too busy or too selfish or too damaged to care. "You're not useless," I said quietly, adjusting her pillow. "You're healing. That takes strength." Mrs. Chen turned her head to look at me, and something in her dark eyes was too knowing, too perceptive. "What happened to you, dear?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm fine. I'm here to take care of you." "Your hands are shaking. You've checked that IV line 3 times, even though it's perfectly positioned. And you look like you haven't slept in days." She patted the edge of the bed. "Sit. Tell me." I should have made an excuse and left. I had other patients to check on medication schedules, to follow a professional distance to maintain. But something about her directness, her refusal to let me hide behind my nurse's uniform, broke through the careful walls I'd built over the past 3 days. I sat down on the edge of her bed and started to cry. It wasn't gentle crying. It was the kind of sobbing that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it existed until it rips its way out. Weeks of humiliation, decades of rejection, a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. All of it came pouring out in that sterile hospital room while an elderly woman I'd just met held my hand and let me break. "Why?" I finally managed to choke out. "I tried so hard. I did everything right. I saved lives. I worked doubles. I never complained. I helped anyone who asked. Why don't they love me? What's wrong with me that my own family would rather hide me than acknowledge I exist?" Mrs. Chen didn't answer immediately. She waited until my breathing slowed, until the sobs turned to hiccups, until I could look at her without my vision swimming. Then she squeezed my hand, and when she spoke, her voice was firm, despite her age. "My dear, you're asking the wrong question." I blinked at her through tears. "What? The question isn't, why don't they love me? The question is, why did I spend so many years begging for crumbs from people who should have been honoured to have me?" She shifted in her bed to face me more fully. "You save lives. That's what you do, what you just did for me, by checking that I was healing properly, by treating me like I matter, even though my own children can't be bothered to visit. You stayed kind, even when they were cruel to you, and they still seated you behind a pillar." Her words hit me like a physical force. I'd spent my entire life believing that if I could just be good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, eventually they'd see my worth. But Mrs. Chen was right. I'd been asking the wrong question all along. "That's not about your worth, honey." She continued, her eyes fierce despite her frail body. "That's about their shame, about their inability to see value in someone who didn't fit their narrative, about their need for someone to diminish so they could feel bigger." I sat in silence, letting her words sink in like medicine I didn't know I needed. For the first time in my life, I began to see that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the problem. Maybe the family that had spent 3 decades erasing me was broken, in ways that had nothing to do with me. Maybe their inability to love me said more about their capacity than my worthiness. The realization didn't erase the pain, didn't undo the years of damage, didn't make the wedding disaster any less humiliating. But it planted something new in my chest, a seed of understanding that I hadn't been asking for too much. I'd been asking from the wrong people. Mrs. Chen must have seen something shift in my expression because she smiled, patted my hand again. "There you are," she said softly. "I can see you starting to believe it." "It's hard," I whispered. "They've spent my whole life making me feel invisible." "Stop asking for their permission to exist, dear." She squeezed my hand one more time. "You were born worthy. You were born enough. And the people who can't see that, that's their loss, not your failure." I nodded slowly, and something in my chest that had been soft and wounded my entire life began to harden, not into bitterness, but into something stronger. Not anger exactly, but resolve. The kind of determination that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else to validate your existence and start doing it yourself. I stayed with Mrs. Chen longer than necessary that night, checking on her between other patients, making sure she was comfortable. And when my shift ended at dawn, I didn't feel healed exactly, but I felt different, like I'd been carrying a question my whole life that Mrs. Chen had finally answered. I wasn't the problem. I never had been. And it was time I stopped acting like I was. Sarah called as I was drinking my second cup of coffee, still processing the shift in perspective Mrs. Chen had given me. "How was your first night back?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing in that way only a best friend can manage. "Hard," I admitted, but also clarifying. "Sarah, I think I'm finally ready to stop being silent." There was a pause, then Sarah's voice came back stronger. "Good. Because Meg, I've watched you be quiet your whole life, letting them write your story for you. It's time you tell your story. It's time you fight back." The words settled into the resolve Mrs. Chen had planted. "I don't know where to start." "Start with what you know," Sarah said practically. "Daniel mentioned Emma might have left evidence. What about that old laptop she borrowed from you years ago, the one you kept meaning to wipe and donate?" My heart skipped. "It's still in my storage unit. I never got around to clearing it out." "Then go get it. Today. Right now." An hour later, I was standing in front of my storage unit, on the outskirts of Portland, the keys shaking slightly in my hand. I hadn't been here in over a year. It was where I kept things I couldn't bear to throw away, but didn't have room for in my small apartment. My mother's boxes, old textbooks, and, yes, buried under a stack of winter clothes, my old laptop from nursing school. I brought it back to Sarah's house and plugged it in, half expecting it not to boot up after all these years. But it hummed to life, and when I opened the file directory, my stomach dropped. Emma had used this laptop for nearly 3 months before returning it, claiming her own had crashed. And she'd never deleted a single file. The folder was labelled innocuously Work Projects 2023, but inside was a systematic campaign I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. There were dozens of emails, all sent from an address designed to look like mine, megan.davis.arn@gmail.com instead of my actual Megan. Davis@gmail.com. The tiny difference would be invisible at a glance. Each email was addressed to Daniel, written in a voice that sounded nothing like me, but that Emma had clearly crafted to seem unstable. They rambled, they accused, they said Daniel was probably like all the other men who thought they were too good for someone like me. They called him shallow, materialistic, unworthy of a real relationship. One particularly vicious email accused him of only dating Emma to spite the sister who'd never measure up. I felt sick reading them. Daniel must have seen these and believed I was jealous, bitter, unhinged. No wonder Emma had been able to paint me as the unstable sister. She'd been building that narrative in his inbox for months before he even met me. But the emails were just the beginning. In a subfolder labelled Insurance, I found something that made my hands go numb. Psychiatric evaluation forms dated 6 months ago, shortly after Emma had met Daniel, with my name on them. The diagnosis, antisocial personality disorder, with violent ideation toward family members. The evaluating physician's signature was a Dr. Marcus Brennan, someone I'd never heard of in my life. There was more. A journal formatted to look handwritten, but clearly typed with my signature forged at the bottom of each page. The entries were dated over the past 2 years, each one more disturbing than the last. Emma has everything I want. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like if she just disappeared. I saw Emma with Daniel today. The rage I felt was almost uncontrollable. Maybe if Emma wasn't in the picture, people would finally see me. I was staring at a fabricated psychiatric history designed to make me look dangerous. And at the bottom of the last document in Emma's actual handwriting on a scanned note, insurance policy if she ever tries to talk. Recommendation. Patient may require involuntary evaluation if symptoms escalate. The implications crashed over me. Emma hadn't just stolen credit for saving Daniel's life. She'd built an entire framework to destroy my credibility if I ever challenged her. If I tried to tell Daniel the truth about that night, she could have produced these documents, claimed I was delusional, maybe even had me committed. My phone was already in my hand calling Daniel when I saw one more file. An email chain between Emma and someone listed only as R, Aunt Ruth. The timestamp was from 13 months ago, right after Emma had first met Daniel at one of his corporate events. Emma's message was brief. He'll never know it was me who saved him. She doesn't deserve credit for anything. Phase 1, complete. When do we move to phase 2? Ruth's response, careful. If you're going to build a relationship on this foundation, you need to make sure she can never contradict you. I'll handle the documentation. I stared at the screen, my entire understanding of my family shifting like tectonic plates. This wasn't opportunistic lying. This was a conspiracy planned and executed with my aunt's legal expertise, designed not just to steal my moment of kindness, but to ensure I could never reclaim it. Phase 1, complete. When do we move to phase 2? What the hell was phase 2? Melissa looked terrified when we met her at a coffee shop, 40 minutes outside Portland, far enough that she wouldn't risk running into anyone from Emma's circle. She was in her late 20s, professionally dressed, but her hand shook as she stirred sugar into coffee she never drank. I shouldn't be here, she said, glancing at the door. Emma has connections. If she finds out I talked to you... She won't, Daniel said firmly. We're not going to use your name. We just need to understand what we're dealing with. Melissa took a breath, seemed to make a decision. Emma used to brag about you, she said, looking at me. She'd say things like, Megan owes me everything, or my sister thinks she's so much better than me, but she has no idea. I never understood what she meant. She paused. But about 8 months ago, I saw her take a box from a storage unit. Old letters, photographs. She said they were insurance, that if you ever caused problems, she had ways to shut you down. My chest tightened. Do you know where these letters came from? She said they were from your father's house, from your mother's things, your biological mother. Melissa looked at Daniel apologetically. I'm sorry, I should have said something sooner, but I needed this job and Emma, she's not someone you cross. After Melissa left, Daniel and I sat in his truck in the parking lot, both of us processing. Your father's house, he said finally. When would they be out? Dad's at a medical conference this week. Linda's visiting her sister in California. They won't be back until Sunday. Daniel started the engine. Then, we're going today. We used my old key, the one I'd never returned, because some part of me had always hoped I might be welcomed home someday. The house was empty and silent, and I led Daniel straight to the basement storage room I'd discovered years ago, but had been told never to enter. The door was locked, but Daniel had brought tools, and within minutes we were inside. The room smelled of dust and neglect. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, labelled with Linda's neat handwriting, Christmas decorations, tax records, 1995-2000 kitchen items. But in the back corner, almost hidden behind a broken chair, was a box with different handwriting. My father's handwriting, Sarah's personal items. My hands were shaking so badly Daniel had to help me open it. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. Letters I'd never received. Letters that should have been given to me after she died when I was 5 years old, or when I was old enough to read them myself. I opened the first one with trembling fingers. "My darling Megan," it began. "You're only 4 years old as I write this, but I want you to know how much I love you. The doctors say I don't have much time left, so I'm writing these letters for you to read when you're older. I want you to know that you are brilliant, kind, and capable of anything you dream of." I couldn't read any more through my tears. Daniel quietly picked up another letter, then another, reading excerpts aloud while I struggled to breathe. My mother had written dozens of them, documenting her love, her hopes for my future, her pride in the little girl I'd been. Every letter I'd never received, every word of encouragement I desperately needed during all those years of feeling invisible. But it was the last letter that destroyed me. It was dated 3 days before she died, her handwriting shakier but still legible. "My darling Megan, if you're reading this, someone has been lying to you for years. I've set up an educational trust fund in your name at First National Bank account number 24789. It's $75,000, enough for college and medical school. I made sure the paperwork was airtight. If anyone tells you I left nothing behind, they're lying. Don't let them steal your future." Daniel was already on his phone pulling up banking records through his lawyer's access to public financial databases. His face went pale as he read the screen. "Megan, the account was emptied 15 years ago, when you turned 22. He looked up at me, his expression grim. "The withdrawal authorization shows your signature, but the funds were transferred to an account belonging to Emma M. Davis." The room spun. $75,000. Money my mother had set aside to ensure I wouldn't struggle the way she had. Money that would have paid for my undergraduate degree, my nursing program, maybe even left enough for a down payment on a house. Instead, I'd worked 3 jobs while going to community college, taken out loans that would take me another decade to pay off, lived in studio apartments and eaten ramen because I couldn't afford anything better. And Emma had taken it all, used my mother's love for me to fund her own life while I struggled. "They forged your signature," Daniel said quietly. "Ruth did this. She had to have. She's the only one with the legal knowledge to pull it off." I picked up my mother's last letter again, reading through tears. The postscript at the bottom said, "Don't let Linda or her family make you feel small. You are my greatest gift. You were born to shine. Never forget that, my darling girl. Never let them make you forget." But they had made me forget. For 32 years, they'd convinced me I was the problem, that I was worth less than Emma, that I deserved to be hidden behind pillars and excluded from family photos and treated like an inconvenience. And all along, they'd been stealing from me, stealing my mother's letters, my inheritance, my very identity as someone who'd been deeply loved. I looked at Daniel through my tears. "Phase 2, I whispered. This was phase 2. They didn't just take credit for what I did. They took everything my mother left me and used it to build Emma's life instead." Daniel's jaw was set in a way I'd come to recognize. He was furious, but he was channeling it into action. "Then, we're going to take it back. All of it. Every single thing they stole from you." "How?" He held up his phone, showing me screenshots he'd already taken. "Evidence, documentation, and a very good lawyer who specializes in fraud and forgery. We're going to make them pay, Megan, in every way that matters." Catherine Walsh spread the bank records across Daniel's dining room table like evidence at a crime scene, which in a way they were. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and precise, the kind of attorney who'd built her career on financial fraud cases. Daniel had hired her after the wedding disaster, and she'd been methodical in tracking every dollar. The trust fund your mother established was set up properly, Catherine said, pointing to documents from 15 years ago. $75,000 held at First National Bank, with you as the sole beneficiary. The terms specified it was to be released when you turned 22 for educational expenses. She looked up at me. But someone else accessed it instead. Daniel leaned forward. Walk us through it. Catherine pulled out a timeline she'd constructed. The withdrawals started the month you turned 22. $30,000 went directly to Cascade University for tuition, Emma's undergraduate education at a private school. $25,000 was transferred to pay for her graduate program in event management 2 years later. $15,000 went to a car dealership and apartment security deposits for her first place after graduation. The remaining $5,000 was withdrawn as cash over 6 months. I felt sick. While Emma was living in a nice apartment and driving a new car, I'd been working overnight shifts at a nursing home to afford my community college classes. I'd eaten ramen for years because I couldn't afford real groceries. I'd delayed nursing school for 3 years because I couldn't get approved for enough loans. But there's more, Catherine continued, her expression darkening. 6 months after the trust fund was emptied, 3 credit cards were opened in your name. Different banks, all using your social security number and forged applications. My hands went cold. I never opened any credit cards. I know. Someone maxed out all 3 roughly $30,000 in charges, then stopped making payments. The accounts went to collections, destroying your credit score. That's why you've never been able to refinance your student loans. Why you got denied for that apartment 3 years ago. The room tilted. They hadn't just stolen my mother's money, they'd actively sabotaged my ability to build any kind of financial security. Every struggle I'd faced had been by design. Total financial impact, Catherine said, is approximately $180,000 when you factor in the stolen inheritance, fraudulent debt, interest and lost opportunity costs over 15 years. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Can we prosecute? Yes. The discovery rule applies. The statute of limitations begins when you discovered the fraud. We're well within the window to file both civil and criminal charges. Catherine looked at me seriously. But they'll fight back. They'll claim you knew about it all along, that you're mentally unstable. Ruth will use every legal trick she knows. My phone rang. Dad. I hadn't spoken to him since the wedding. I almost didn't answer, but something in me needed to hear what he had to say. I put it on speaker. Megan. His voice was shaking. Linda told me what you've been doing. Hiring lawyers, going through bank records. You need to come home right now. I don't think we have anything to talk about, I said coldly. You don't understand. There are things about your mother, about the family, that you don't know. Things I should have told you 30 years ago. He paused. Please, Megan, let me explain before you destroy this family. Daniel and Catherine were watching me, waiting. I thought about my mother's letters, about the money she'd saved, so I wouldn't struggle about 30 years of being treated like I didn't matter. Fine, I said. I'll come. But Daniel and my attorney are coming with me. And Dad, whatever you're about to tell me better be the truth, because I'm done with lies. I walked into my childhood home for what I knew would be the last time, Daniel on my right and Catherine on my left, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy whatever remained of this family. Linda was waiting in the living room, standing like a general preparing for battle. Aunt Ruth sat in the wing-back chair, her lawyer posture rigid and defensive, and my father sat on the couch, his face grey and defeated, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 4 weeks. Linda didn't wait for pleasantries. How dare you? She hissed, her voice shaking with rage. How dare you hire lawyers and investigators to go after your own family? You're trying to destroy Emma's life because you've always been jealous of her. I'm not here to argue, I said, my voice steady. I walked to the dining room table and set down the folders Catherine and I had organised. I'm here to show you what you've done. I opened the first folder, spreading my mother's letters across the polished wood surface. These are letters my mother wrote to me before she died, letters you hid from me for 32 years, letters where she told me she loved me, where she documented setting up a trust fund to pay for my education. Linda's face flushed. Those were private family documents. They were addressed to me. I cut her off. They were mine, and you stole them. I opened the second folder, pulling out the bank records. This is documentation showing that $75,000 money my mother saved for my education was stolen 15 years ago using forged signatures. The money paid for Emma's college, her graduate school, her first apartment and car. While I worked 3 jobs and took out loans, I'm still paying off. Ruth stood up abruptly. You have no proof those signatures were forged. This is slander. We have a handwriting analyst's report, Catherine said calmly, speaking for the first time. We have metadata from the bank showing the authorization forms were scanned and digitally altered. And we have your billing records showing you were paid $5,000 by Emma the same month the transfers occurred. Ruth's face went white. I opened the third folder. And these are the fake psychiatric records Emma created 6 months ago, diagnosing me with violent tendencies and antisocial personality disorder. Records you threatened to use against me to have me declared incompetent. I looked directly at Ruth. We have the metadata from Emma's laptop showing when these documents were created. We have testimony from her former assistant about the conspiracy. And we have text messages between you two discussing phase 2 of your plan. The silence in the room was deafening. Linda was gripping the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Ruth had sunk back into her seat, her lawyer's composure cracking, and my father just sat there, tears streaming down his face, saying nothing. This is what you've done to me, I said, my voice breaking despite my determination to stay strong. For 15 years, for 30 years, you stole my mother's love letters. You stole my inheritance. You destroyed my credit. You created fake medical records to make me look insane. And through it all, you made me believe I was the problem, that I was the one who wasn't good enough. Linda found her voice desperate now. James, say something, defend your family. My father looked up at her, and for the first time in my life I saw something in his eyes besides weakness. It was rage. Which family, Linda, he whispered. My dead wife's daughter. Or yours. Linda recoiled as if she'd been slapped. How can you, after everything I've done for you... Enough! My father's shout made everyone jump. He stood up abruptly, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the evidence folders bounce. Stop lying, all of you! He turned to Linda and Ruth, his voice shaking with decades of suppressed anger and grief. Tell Megan the truth about why we really treated her this way all these years. Tell her about Sarah. Tell her about the diary you found 6 months after we got married. Tell her everything, or, so help me God, I will. Linda's face crumpled. Ruth looked away, and I stood there, my heart pounding finally, about to learn the truth that had poisoned my entire life. Tell me what, I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. What did you find in my mother's diary? My father sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red and haunted. Your mother Sarah was the love of my life, he said, his voice breaking. From the moment I met her, I knew I'd never love anyone else the same way. We had something rare, Megan. Something most people never find. I know that, I said quietly. I've seen the photos. I've read her letters, the ones Linda hid from me. When she died, when the cancer took her, I made her a promise. His hands were shaking. I was holding her hand in that hospital room, and you were sleeping in the chair beside us, just 5 years old. She made me swear I would always protect you, always love you the way she did, never let you feel alone in this world. I promised her. I swore on everything I held sacred. Linda made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. But my father didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. 3 years later, I married Linda. Emma was just born. I thought. He paused, struggling for words. I thought I could build a new family, that I could keep my promise to your mother while also moving forward. But Linda found your mother's diary 6 months after our wedding. I didn't know until years later, but she read every page. What did it say? My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Linda answered, her voice hollow. That she was the love of his life. That their connection was once in a lifetime. That she was grateful you looked exactly like him, because you'd always be reminded of their love. She laughed bitterly. Every beautiful word she wrote was a knife in my chest, because I knew I could never compete with a ghost. So you punished me for existing, I said flatly. I punished you for being proof. Linda's composure shattered completely. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. Your eyes, your smile, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. You were a walking reminder that I was second choice, that James only married me because he couldn't have the woman he really wanted. My father was crying openly now. Linda gave me an ultimatum. She said if I wanted this marriage to work, I had to let Sarah's memory go. Treat you like any other child, no special attention, no favoritism. Stop visiting Sarah's grave. Stop talking about her, just forget. He looked at me with such anguish, it was almost physical. I was a coward, Megan. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I let Linda and Ruth handle things with you eventually, the resentment would fade. But it never did. It just got worse. You let them steal from me, I said, my voice shaking. You let them hide my mother's letters. You let them take the money she saved for me. You sat there and watched them make me invisible. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. And every year, on your birthday, I still visited Sarah's grave. I couldn't help myself. I'd tell her about you, about how you'd grown up kind and strong despite everything. And Linda knew. She always knew. And every year, she found new ways to punish you for the fact that I couldn't let your mother go. And the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The forgotten birthdays had always coincided with the anniversary of my mother's death. The worst humiliations had come around the times my father would disappear for a few hours visiting the cemetery. Linda had spent 30 years taking revenge on a child for crimes that existed only in her own jealous mind. I looked at Linda, really looked at her, and saw not a monster but a deeply broken woman who'd spent 3 decades competing with someone who'd been dead before the competition even started. And I looked at my father and saw a man who'd chosen the path of least resistance over the daughter he'd promised to protect. So I was punished my entire life. I said, my voice eerily calm despite the storm raging inside me, because I reminded you of the woman you couldn't stop loving and the woman you could never be. Neither of them could meet my eyes. 37 years, I continued. You let me suffer for 37 years because of your guilt and her jealousy. You let me believe I was the problem, that I wasn't enough, that I deserved to be hidden and forgotten and erased. I picked up my mother's letters, held them against my chest. But my mother knew better. She knew exactly who you were. That's why she hid these letters, why she set up that trust fund, why she made sure there was documentation. She knew you'd try to erase me, and she tried to protect me even after she was gone. I turned to Daniel and Catherine. I think we're done here. My father stood up. Megan, please. Please. What? I looked at him. Please. Forgive you. Please understand. Please keep this quiet so you don't have to face consequences. I shook my head. Maybe it's time everyone outside this house learns the truth too. About all of it. I should have known Emma wouldn't let me control the narrative. Within 24 hours of leaving my father's house, the story exploded across social media. Not my version, Emma's. She posted a tearful video that got shared thousands of times. My sister has severe mental health issues. She's always been unstable, jealous of me. On what should have been the happiest day of my life, she decided to destroy everything. I'm heartbroken, but I want people to know the truth about her dangerous behaviour. Aunt Ruth had clearly hired professionals. Within 48 hours, the hashtag Megan Davis liar was trending locally. Fake accounts popped up, pretending to be me posting unhinged messages, like, Emma always wins. Maybe it's time she loses more than just a wedding. My real social media accounts were mass reported and suspended before I could defend myself. Local micro-influencers I'd never heard of were sharing Emma's video with captions about toxic family members and when jealousy turns dangerous. The death threats started on day 3. Strangers found my home address and posted it online. Someone left a bag of garbage on my doorstep with a note, "This is what liars deserve." At work, colleagues who'd been friendly for years suddenly found reasons to avoid me. A few texted support, but mostly there was just silence and sideways glances that said they'd already decided who to believe. I sat in my apartment, watching my life crumble in real time, unable to stop it. Sarah called every hour begging me to respond to fight back, but I felt paralysed by the sheer scale of Emma's attack. She'd weaponised the internet against me and I had no idea how to compete. Then, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognise. "Ms. Davis, this is Jennifer Park from Channel 8 News. Your story is everywhere right now. We'd like to give you a chance to tell your side on camera. Would you be willing to do an interview?" I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over the accept button. Sarah was beside me instantly. "This is it, Meg. This is your chance to defend yourself." Daniel called minutes later with the same urgency. "You need to do this interview. Clear your name before Emma destroys you completely." But something held me back, and I couldn't explain it at first. I sat there in my quiet apartment thinking about Mrs. Chen's words from weeks ago. Stop asking for permission to exist. And suddenly I understood why I was hesitating. "I'm tired of defending myself," I said quietly, when Sarah asked why I wasn't immediately saying yes. "All my life I've been trying to prove I'm not the bad sister, the jealous one, the embarrassment. I've spent 37 years asking them to see my worth. But what if I don't need to prove anything anymore?" Sarah looked confused. "But you have to respond. You have to show people Emma is lying." "Do I?" I met her eyes. "Or what if I go on TV not to defend myself against their lies, but simply to tell the truth because I deserve to be heard? Not because I need anyone's approval, but because my story matters, my voice matters, and I'm done asking permission to speak." Daniel, listening on speakerphone, was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. "That's the difference between defending yourself and honouring yourself. You're not fighting to prove them wrong. You're fighting to prove to yourself that you matter." "Exactly," I whispered. "So yes, I'll do the interview, but I'm doing it my way." I picked up my phone and called the producer back. "I'll do the interview, Ms. Park, but I want it live. No editing, no cuts, no safety net. Just me telling the truth, looking straight into the camera. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "That's risky for you, Ms. Davis. If you slip up, make a mistake, say something you regret." "I won't." I cut her off, because I'm done being afraid of the truth. The television studio felt smaller than I'd imagined, all bright lights and cameras and the nervous energy of a live broadcast. Jennifer Park, the anchor, had kind eyes, but a journalist's sharp focus. I sat across from her in my navy blue scrubs, having come directly from my shift at Portland General. It was a deliberate choice. I wanted people to see me as I actually was, not as some polished version trying to compete with Emma's carefully curated image. "We're live in 30 seconds, the producer said, and my heart hammered against my ribs. Daniel squeezed my shoulder from where he stood just off camera. "Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." The red light blinked on. Jennifer turned to the camera with her professional smile. "Good evening. Tonight we have an exclusive interview with Megan Davis, the woman at the center of a viral story about a wedding that ended in shocking revelations. Shrin Davis, your sister has made serious allegations about your mental health and behavior. What do you want people to know? I looked directly into the camera and felt something settle inside me. I want to tell you what actually happened. All of it. Not my version against hers, just the facts, with documentation to support every word. For the next 20 minutes, I laid it out methodically. I started with my childhood, the lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed. But I didn't dwell on emotion. I presented it as context. Then I moved to the accident 1 year ago on Highway 26. I showed the 911 call records, with my voice clearly identified as the caller, the timestamp proving I was there. I explained how I'd stabilised. Daniel kept him conscious and left before giving my full information because I'd just been doing my job. Emma claimed she saved him, I said calmly. She built an entire relationship with Daniel based on taking credit for something I did. When I showed up at her wedding, I had no idea Daniel was the man I'd saved. I didn't know until he recognised me and said so publicly. I showed my mother's letters, holding them up to the camera so viewers could see the handwriting, the dates, the love in every word. These letters were hidden from me for 32 years. My mother died when I was 5, and she'd written to tell me about $75,000 trust fund she'd established for my education. I never received the letters or the money. Jennifer leaned forward. Where did the money go? It was stolen 15 years ago, using forged signatures. I displayed the bank records, the forensic handwriting analysis, the timeline showing how the money paid for Emma's private university education, while I worked 3 jobs to afford community college. I also discovered that credit cards were fraudulently opened in my name, destroying my credit score and sabotaging my financial future for over a decade. And the studio was silent except for my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't plead for sympathy. I just presented fact after fact, document after document, letting the evidence speak for itself. I showed the fake psychiatric records Emma had created, the metadata proving they were fabricated on her computer 6 months ago, the insurance policy notation in her handwriting. My family didn't just overlook me, I said quietly. They systematically erased me, stole from me, and when I finally started asking questions, they tried to destroy my credibility so no one would believe me. Jennifer's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to visible shock. These are serious allegations. Do you have legal representation? I do, and we're pursuing both civil and criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and identity theft. What do you want people watching to understand? I paused, choosing my words carefully. I'm not here to make my family look bad. I'm here because I spent 37 years believing I was the problem, that I wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of love or recognition. But I've learned that when someone makes you feel invisible, it says everything about them and nothing about your worth. I'm speaking up not because I need anyone's approval, but because my story deserves to be told. And maybe someone else who's been made to feel invisible will hear this and realise they're not alone. The camera held on my face for a long moment, and I didn't look away. Then Jennifer said, "We have someone else who'd like to speak. Daniel Carter, would you join us?" Daniel walked onto the set and sat beside me. He looked directly at the camera, his voice steady. I was engaged to Emma Davis. I broke off the engagement after discovering she lied about saving my life, lied about Megan, and participated in a coordinated effort to destroy her sister's reputation and finances. I'm here tonight to say publicly I believe Megan Davis. Every word she's told you is true, and I'm standing with her. The interview ended. As the crew began shutting down equipment, Jennifer shook my hand. That was powerful, really powerful. Our phones are already lighting up. My own phone was exploding with notifications. Text after text from people I hadn't heard from in years, from strangers who'd watched, from women saying, "Me too," and "I believe you," and "Thank you for speaking up." The tide was turning. I could feel it. But then 2 messages cut through the support like knives. The first was from an unknown number. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Watch what happens next." The second was a news alert that made my blood run cold. "Breaking Emma Davis files emergency restraining order against sister Megan Davis, citing threats and harassment." Daniel saw my face and took the phone from my shaking hands. He read both messages, and his expression hardened. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "They are going to fight back with everything they have." I looked at him, then at the phone still buzzing with supportive messages from strangers who finally saw me, and I realised something. I wasn't afraid anymore. Let them fight back, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting alone. I arrived at Portland General the next morning feeling lighter than I had in months. The interview had aired to overwhelming support. Colleagues who'd been avoiding me suddenly stopped to say they'd watched, that they believed me, that they were sorry for doubting. For the first time since the wedding disaster, I felt like maybe everything would be okay. Then, I saw the police officers waiting in the staff lounge. "Megan Davis, the taller one asked, his expression apologetic but professional. "We need to serve you with a court order." My supervisor, Patricia, stood nearby, her face troubled. I took the envelope with shaking hands and read the header, "Emergency Temporary Restraining Order." The petition, filed by Emma Davis and prepared by Ruth Morrison, attorney at law, claimed I had sent threatening text messages to Emma over the past week. There were screenshots, attached messages from my number saying things like, "You'll pay for what you've done," and "I know where you live." Messages I'd never sent. There were photos too, supposedly showing my car parked near Emma's apartment building on multiple occasions. Grainy, distant shots that could have been any silver Honda, but they'd been time-stamped and geotagged with metadata I had no way of immediately disproving. And attached to everything was the fake psychiatric evaluation from months ago presented as evidence of my dangerous mental state. "A judge signed this based on the evidence provided," the officer explained. "You're required to stay at least 500 feet away from Emma Davis for 7 days. You have the right to contest it in court, but until then, you must comply." "These are lies," I said, my voice shaking. "I never sent those messages. I haven't been to her apartment. This is all fabricated." "That's for the court to determine, Ma'am. We're just here to serve the order." After they left, Patricia called me into her office. She looked genuinely pained. "Megan, I'm so sorry. I watched your interview last night. I believe you, but I have to suspend you with pay until this is resolved. We can't have an employee with an active restraining order working with vulnerable patients. Hospital policy. My hands are tied." I nodded numbly, too shocked to argue. I just lost my job temporarily, but still lost it because of documents I could prove were forged, but not quickly enough to stop the immediate consequences. I gathered my things from my locker and walked out of the hospital in a daze, feeling the stares of co-workers who were now reconsidering everything they'd believed after watching my interview. That afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was strange, tight with stress. "I need to see you. Can I come over?" When he arrived at my apartment an hour later, he looked like he hadn't slept. He sat heavily on my couch and pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Emma ambushed me at a coffee shop this morning. She gave me this." Inside were sealed court documents from 5 years ago. A construction client had claimed Daniel's company had committed fraud charges that were completely false but expensive to fight. Daniel had settled out of court for $200,000 just to make it go away and protect his reputation, and the records had been sealed as part of the settlement. Somehow, Emma had obtained them. "She said, if I continue helping you publicly, she'll send these to every client I have," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "It doesn't matter that the charges were false. The headlines alone would destroy me. I'd lose contracts. I'd have to lay off employees, people who have families, mortgages, kids in college." I felt my chest tighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't be seen with you publicly anymore." He looked at me with such anguish, it was almost worse than if he'd been cold about it. I'll still help behind the scenes. I'll keep paying Catherine. I'll still gather evidence, but I can't appear with you. You can't be photographed. With you can't publicly support you. I'm so sorry, Megan. I have 20 employees who depend on me. I can't let them lose everything because of my connection to your fight. I wanted to be angry, wanted to scream that I needed him, that I couldn't do this alone. But I understood. Emma had found his pressure point and was squeezing. It's okay, I heard myself say. I understand. After he left, I sat in my dark apartment as evening fell. The supportive messages from last night felt very far away now. I'd been suspended from the one place I felt competent. Daniel had been forced to step back. Emma was still free to manipulate, to lie, to destroy, while I was legally barred from even being near her to defend myself. My phone buzzed. Sarah had sent me a link to a news article with the message, "You need to see this." I clicked it and felt my stomach turn. The headline read, "Local woman creates scholarship fund. In sister's honour, Emma Davis gives back." There was a photo of Emma at a charity event wearing a tasteful black dress holding an oversized check for $10,000. The article quoted her, "Despite our family difficulties, I want to honour my sister's dedication to helping others by creating a scholarship for nursing students in need. I hope this shows that forgiveness and compassion can heal even the deepest wounds." I stared at the photo, at Emma's practiced expression of humble generosity, at the way she'd taken my pain and my profession and turned them into a public relations opportunity. She'd stolen my mother's trust fund to build her own life, and now she was using my humiliation to build her public image as a charitable, forgiving sister. The scholarship was probably funded with money she'd stolen from me in the first place. My hands were shaking with a rage so pure it felt almost clarifying. Emma wasn't going to stop. She was going to keep attacking, keep manipulating, keep stealing pieces of my life and using them as props in her performance of victimhood. And now I was suspended from work, legally barred from defending myself, and watching my only ally get blackmailed into silence. I sat in the darkness of my apartment and realised that Emma had been planning this all along. Phase 2 wasn't just about stealing credit or money. It was about making sure that even when I finally spoke up, even when I told the truth, she could still destroy me completely. The darkness I'd been sitting in felt appropriate for where my life had ended up. Suspended from work, legally barred from defending myself, watching Emma turn my pain into a public relations opportunity. But as I stared at that photo of her holding the oversized check, something crystallized inside me. Emma wasn't going to stop until I was completely erased, which meant I couldn't afford to stop either. My phone rang. Daniel's voice was quiet, cautious. "I know I said I had to step back publicly, but I never said I'd stop helping. Can I come over? Not through the front door, through the parking garage. I don't want anyone seeing my car here." An hour later, he was in my apartment with his laptop and a thick folder. I hired a private investigator the day after Emma served that restraining order. His name is Marcus Webb, former detective, very thorough. And Megan, he's found things. Daniel opened the folder and pulled out a report. Emma did this before. 3 years ago, she dated a man named James Kowalski. When he tried to break up with her, she claimed he'd physically abused her. She had bruises, photos, the whole story. James paid her $50,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and dropped the complaint because fighting it would have destroyed his career as a high school teacher. My stomach turned. She extorted him. Marcus tracked him down. He's willing to testify now. He kept everything the NDA, the payment records, even hospital records showing the bruises, were self-inflicted. The attending physician documented inconsistencies in her story. Daniel pulled out another document. But there's more. Marcus found out Emma has a standing lunch appointment every Tuesday at a restaurant called Bella Vista. She meets her friend Tara there. The owner, Maria, remembered them because they always sat at the same table and talked loudly. Why does that matter? Because Bella Vista installed security cameras with audio 6 months ago after a series of thefts. When Marcus explained what was happening to you, Maria was horrified. She let him review the footage legally. She owns it, so she has the right to share it. He turned his laptop toward me and pressed play. The video quality was grainy but clear enough. Emma and another woman sat at a corner table, wine glasses between them. The timestamp showed this was from 6 months ago, right around when Emma had first met Daniel. The audio crackled, but Emma's voice came through clearly. I'm telling you, Tara, this is perfect. Daniel thinks I saved his life. He's so grateful, so devoted. And the best part, Megan has no idea it was her. She probably doesn't even remember stopping to help some random accident victim. Tara's laugh was audible. But what if she figures it out? She won't. And even if she does, who's going to believe her? I've already started building the narrative that she's unstable jealous. Ruth's helping me create documentation. If Megan ever tries to talk, we'll destroy her credibility completely. Emma took a sip of wine. I've wanted to destroy Megan from the start. She's always been in my way, always been Dad's favourite, even though he tries to hide it. If I can make her disappear completely, get her locked up or permanently discredited, everything will be perfect. Daniel will never know the truth, and I'll finally have everything she should have lost years ago. I felt physically sick watching it. This wasn't opportunistic lying. This was premeditated, calculated destruction planned months in advance. Daniel stopped the video. There's more footage, hours of it. Emma talks about forging the psychiatric records, about how Ruth is advising her on legal strategies about the trust fund theft. She's been remarkably careless because she never imagined anyone would check. Why would Maria help us? Because she has a sister who was institutionalized by an abusive husband using false psychiatric claims. It took 2 years to get her out. When Marcus explained what Emma was trying to do to you, Maria said she wouldn't let that happen to another woman if she could prevent it. Daniel pulled out another folder, this one marked with Ruth's name. And Marcus found something else. Ruth has been embezzling from her law firm for the past 3 years. She's been using the same signature forgery techniques she used to steal your trust fund. Small amounts carefully hidden, but Marcus found the pattern. If this comes to light, she'll lose her law license and face criminal charges. That's leverage, I said slowly. Exactly. Ruth can either back off completely or risk losing everything she's built. Daniel spread documents across my coffee table. With my help, Catherine's been building a complete case. We have James Kowalski's testimony about the extortion. We have the restaurant footage showing premeditation. We have your mother's letters, the forged trust fund documents, the fake psychiatric records with metadata proving when they were created. We have Ruth's embezzlement evidence. It's overwhelming. I looked at the mountain of evidence and felt something shift. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, trying to survive Emma's attacks. But this changed everything. We had proof of a pattern, proof of intent, proof that went far beyond just stealing credit for one act of kindness. We have everything we need, I said quietly, but how do we use it without just becoming like them, fighting dirty, ambushing people, manipulating the truth? Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, We don't ambush her in private. We expose the truth in public, where she can't manipulate the narrative or threaten witnesses into silence. Marcus found out Emma's planning a press conference for 3 days from now. She's going to clear her name and announce an expansion of that fake scholarship fund. She's expecting sympathy, more positive press. He looked at me, and I saw the same determination I felt building in my own chest. What if we show up with all of this evidence? With James, with the video, with everything? Not to attack her, but to simply present the truth in a setting where she can't spin it or shut us down. I thought about Mrs. Chen's words about not asking permission to exist, about the live stream that had turned public opinion in my favour, about the fact that Emma had spent months planning my destruction in darkness, betting I'd stay silent and invisible the way I always had. "She's counting on me staying quiet," I said. "She's counting on me being too afraid or too polite to fight back publicly." "Then let's prove her wrong," Daniel said. I looked at the evidence spread across my coffee table, proof of decades of calculated cruelty, and nodded slowly. 3 days. We prepare everything, make sure every piece of evidence is documented and verified. And then we show the world exactly who Emma Davis really is. The Riverside Hotel's conference room was already packed when we arrived. Camera crews from every local news station lined the back wall. Reporters filled the seats, and Emma stood at the front podium, flanked by Linda and Aunt Ruth like generals protecting their commander. Emma wore a pale pink blouse and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the carefully calculated image of vulnerability and sincerity. Daniel, Catherine and I stayed in the hallway outside, watching through the small window in the door. Catherine had filed an emergency motion this morning, arguing that I had the right to respond to false public statements, but we hadn't heard back from the judge yet. The restraining order was technically still active. If we walked in there, Emma could have me arrested for violating it. "We don't have to do this," Daniel said quietly. "We could wait for the legal process, let Catherine handle it in court where Emma can't perform for cameras." I shook my head. "She's about to tell lies about me to every news outlet in Portland. If I let her control this narrative one more time, it won't matter what a judge says later. The damage will be done." I looked at Catherine. "What are the chances the judge approves our motion?" "Honestly, 50-50. It's unconventional, but if we go in there without approval, then I get arrested for violating a restraining order obtained through fraud." I took a breath. "I'm going in anyway." Through the window, I watched Emma step up to the microphone. The room quieted immediately. She took a moment seeming to gather herself, then began speaking in a soft, trembling voice. "Thank you all for coming. This has been the hardest 2 months of my life. My sister, Megan, has severe mental health issues that our family has tried to manage for years. We've gotten her help. We've been patient, but she became fixated on me, on my success, my relationships, my happiness. When I got engaged to a wonderful man, her delusions escalated." I watched reporters taking notes, cameras recording. Linda nodded supportively beside Emma, playing the role of concerned mother. Aunt Ruth stood with her arms crossed, projecting legal authority. "The truth is, Emma continued, her voice breaking perfectly. On cue, "Megan has always struggled with jealousy and reality. She has convinced herself of things that never happened. When she disrupted my wedding with false accusations, I tried to be understanding. I know she's not well. But then she went on television and told lies that have damaged my reputation, my career, my relationship. I'm here today not to attack her, but to set the record straight before her delusions hurt anyone else." But something was different from what Emma had probably expected. Several reporters were exchanging glances, whispering to each other. One older journalist in the third row raised his hand. "Ms. Davis, we saw the live stream 2 nights ago where mental health workers attempted to take your sister into custody the evening before this press conference. The timing seems convenient. Can you comment on whether you were involved in that action?" Emma's perfect mask slipped for just a second. That was for her own safety. She'd been making threats, saying concerning things. We were worried she might hurt herself or others. "But no charges were filed," another reporter interjected, "and the court order was stayed within hours. Some are saying it looks like an attempt to silence her before she could respond to your press conference." "That's ridiculous," Aunt Ruth cut in, stepping toward the microphone. "We have documentation of Megan's mental health issues going back years. The psychiatric evaluation was done for her protection." "Forged documentation." The voice came from the back of the room. My voice. Every head turned as I pushed open the double doors and walked in, Daniel on my right, Catherine on my left. Camera operators swung their equipment toward me, the sudden movement creating a wave of motion through the room. Emma's face went from calculated vulnerability to genuine shock, then to something that looked almost like fear. You can't be here. You're violating the restraining order. Someone call security. The restraining order obtained through fraudulent evidence, Catherine said calmly, her lawyer voice cutting through the chaos. Evidence we're prepared to present to this court of public opinion since your client has chosen to make public accusations. I walked down the centre aisle, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent room. Reporters were scrambling, some already broadcasting live on their phones. I could see the calculation happening behind Emma's eyes. Should she have me removed and look like she was silencing me? Or should she let me speak and risk losing control of her narrative? I stopped directly in front of the podium, close enough that Emma had to look down at me from her elevated position. Linda was reaching for her phone, probably to call security. Aunt Ruth had gone very still, her lawyer's instincts telling her this was about to go very wrong for them. Emma gripped the podium, her knuckles white. What? What are you doing here? You're not allowed. I looked directly at her, then turned to face the cameras, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I'm here to tell the truth, the whole truth, in front of everyone, because you've spent 8 weeks lying about me, and I'm done letting you control what people believe. I opened the folder in my hands, pulled out the first document, and held it up for the cameras to see. This is my mother's death certificate. Sarah Elizabeth Davis died of cancer 32 years ago when I was 5 years old. Emma is my half-sister, born 3 years after my mother died. And everything Emma has just told you is built on a foundation of lies that goes back 3 decades. Emma was shaking now, her carefully constructed performance crumbling in real time. You're having a breakdown. Everyone can see you're not stable. Then let me prove otherwise, I said calmly. Let me present evidence. Let me show these reporters the documents you've been hiding, the people you've been silencing, the truth you've been desperate to bury, unless you're afraid of what they'll find. The challenge hung in the air. Emma looked at Aunt Ruth, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, but it was too late. Every camera in the room was on us now, and walking away would look like exactly what it was, an admission that she couldn't defend her lies under scrutiny. Fine, Emma said, her voice tight. Present your so-called evidence. Let everyone see how desperate you've become. I looked at Daniel, who nodded and pulled out his phone. On it was the restaurant security footage, cued and ready to play. Let's start, I said, with your own words. Daniel held up his phone, ready to play the restaurant footage that would expose Emma's premeditation. But as I looked around the conference room at the cameras, at the reporters, at Emma standing elevated at the podium, while I stood below her on the floor, I realised something. Evidence was important, but this moment needed to be more than just facts. It needed to be a statement. I walked to the side of the room where the hotel staff had stacked extra chairs. I picked up a simple metal folding chair, the same kind that had been placed behind the pillar at the wedding 8 weeks ago. The sound of it scraping across the floor as I carried it echoed in the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. Every camera turned to follow me. Every reporter stopped typing. I walked to the centre of the small stage area directly in front of Emma's podium and placed the chair in the spotlight. Then I sat down, positioned myself so I was looking directly into the main camera lens, and began to speak. For 37 years I sat in the shadows. I made myself small. I stayed quiet. I apologised for existing. I believed that if I was just good enough, kind enough, invisible enough, maybe one day I'd earn a place at the table. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. But I've learned something. I was never supposed to earn it because they never planned to give it. This family needed someone to blame, someone to carry their shame, someone to make Emma look better by comparison. Emma started to interrupt. I'm not finished. My voice was calm but absolutely firm. You've had 8 weeks to tell your version. Now it's my turn. I stood up from the chair but didn't move away from it. Instead, I turned to face Linda, who stood frozen beside the podium. Linda, you hated me before you even met me, not because of anything I did, but because I looked like my mother, the woman my father never stopped loving. Instead of dealing with your own insecurity, instead of talking to your husband about your feelings, you took it out on a child for 30 years. Linda's face crumpled, but I moved on, turning to Aunt Ruth. Ruth, you helped Emma steal my inheritance. $75,000 my mother saved for my education. You used your legal expertise to forge documents to transfer money that was never yours to touch. Not because you believed I didn't deserve it, but because you enjoyed having power over someone who couldn't fight back. Ruth's lawyer mask finally shattered. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes or the cameras. Then I turned to Emma, still standing at the podium, tears streaming down her face. And you built your entire identity on being better than Megan, the pretty sister, the successful sister, the one who deserved love and attention and opportunities. But here's what I finally understand. You needed me to be less so you could be more. You needed me in the shadows so your light looked brighter. But now that I'm standing here in the spotlight in front of everyone, who are you, without me to stand on? Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. I turned back to the cameras, to the reporters, to the thousands of people who would watch this later. To everyone watching this, if you've ever been seated behind the pillar, if you've ever been told you should be grateful just to be included, if you've ever been made to feel like you're too much or not enough or just wrong, hear this. I felt my voice growing stronger, more powerful. You don't need their table. You don't need their light. You don't need their permission to exist, because the throne was never behind the pillar. The throne was wherever I decided to sit, and today I choose to sit in my own light. I picked up the microphone Emma had been using, walked back to the folding chair in the spotlight, and placed the microphone gently on the seat. The symbolism was clear. I was leaving the spotlight voluntarily on my own terms, not because someone had hidden me there. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. Daniel was there immediately, offering his arm, but not leading me, walking beside me as an equal. Behind us, I heard Emma's sobs, the sound picked up by the microphone I'd left on the chair. I heard reporters shouting questions, camera shutters clicking, the chaos of a carefully constructed narrative, collapsing in real time. Linda was covering her face with her hands. Aunt Ruth was trying to slip toward a side door, but reporters blocked her path, demanding answers about the forged documents and stolen inheritance. And Emma had sunk to her knees beside the podium, her perfect performance destroyed by the weight of truth she could no longer deny. The last thing the cameras captured before I walked out those doors was the empty folding chair in the spotlight, the microphone resting on its seat, and Emma's broken sobs echoing through the speakers. Outside, the late afternoon sun was bright and warm. I stopped on the hotel steps, took my first deep breath in 8 weeks, and felt something lift from my chest that I hadn't even realised I'd been carrying. Daniel stood beside me, respectful of my space, but present. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I smiled, and it felt genuine in a way I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Now, I finally start living for myself. The press conference footage went viral within hours, not just locally, but nationally. The image of me sitting in that folding chair, speaking directly to the camera about reclaiming dignity, became a symbol for something larger than my own story. Women across the country shared it with captions like, "This is me," and "I was behind the pillar too." The hashtag shifted from Megan Davis liar to throne not pillar, and suddenly the conversation wasn't about whether I was telling the truth, it was about how many people had lived their own versions of my experience. Emma's life collapsed in less than 24 hours. Her employer, the event planning company that had employed her for 6 years, issued a statement saying they terminated her position effective immediately. They couldn't afford the association with someone exposed for fraud and systematic manipulation. Her landlord, seeing the news coverage and the protesters who'd gathered outside her apartment building, gave her 30 days' notice. Her friends, the ones who'd stood beside her at the press conference, who'd defended her on social media, went silent. Some deleted their supportive posts. Others issued public apologies for not seeing through her lies. 3 days after the press conference, I received a letter forwarded through Catherine's office, Emma's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single page, her words shaky and uneven. I don't expect forgiveness. I was jealous my entire life and I let it make me into a monster. You deserved none of this. I'm leaving Portland. Maybe somewhere else I can figure out how to be a person who doesn't need to destroy others to feel whole. I'm sorry. Doesn't cover it, but I'm sorry anyway. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer. Maybe someday I'd be ready to forgive her. But that day wasn't today, and I'd learned that was okay. Linda's fall was slower, but equally devastating. Her church community, the same people who'd watched her play the devoted mother for decades, quietly distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Her position on the hospital charity board was regretfully terminated. The country club, where she'd been a member for 20 years, asked her not to renew. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who tormented a child for 30 years out of jealous spite. My father filed for divorce a week after the press conference. His lawyer cited irreconcilable differences and betrayal of fundamental trust. He called me once to say he was sorry that he should have protected me, that he was finally doing what he should have done 3 decades ago. I told him I appreciated the apology, but needed time. He said he understood and that he'd wait as long as it took. Aunt Ruth's consequences were more formal and severe. The Oregon State Bar opened an investigation into the forged documents within days of the press conference. The evidence was overwhelming: the fake psychiatric records, the forged trust fund transfers, the embezzlement from her own firm that Marcus had uncovered. She resigned her law license before they could disbar her, but it didn't save her from the restitution order. $180,000 to be paid back to me, plus Catherine's legal fees. And the district attorney was still deciding whether to pursue criminal fraud charges. For me, the changes were gentler, but profound. The hospital reinstated me 2 days after the press conference. My supervisor, Patricia, called me into her office, but this time it was to apologize. We should have trusted you. Your work has always spoken for itself. We let fear of bad publicity override what we knew about your character, and I'm sorry. When I returned to my first shift, my colleagues had organised a small welcome back celebration in the break room. Nothing elaborate, just coffee and donuts and people I'd worked with for years telling me they were glad I was back. It was simple and genuine, and it meant more than any grand gesture could have. Daniel had been careful to give me space in the immediate aftermath. He'd helped with the legal proceedings coordinated with Catherine, made sure Emma and Ruth couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. But he hadn't pushed for anything personal, hadn't tried to leverage our shared trauma into something romantic. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. 2 weeks after the press conference, he texted, asking if I'd meet him at Laurelhurst Park. I found him sitting on a bench near the pond, watching ducks paddle through the afternoon light. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed he looked different. Lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying weight he'd finally set down. "I have something for you," he said, handing me an envelope. Not another letter, but something official looking. I opened it and saw a cashier's check made out to me for $180,000. Catherine's settlement summary was attached. Emma and Ruth agreed to pay full restitution rather than face criminal prosecution, Daniel explained. The trust fund amount plus interest, the fraudulent credit card debt, and compensation for damages. It's not about the money, I know, but it's about being seen, I said softly, looking at the check that represented my mother's love for me finally restored. It's about being acknowledged, about them admitting legally and publicly that they stole from me and what they did was wrong. Daniel nodded, understanding completely. We sat down on the bench together, watching the ducks, letting the peaceful afternoon settle around us. Finally, he spoke again. I need time to process everything. I almost married someone I didn't truly know, built a relationship on a foundation that was completely false. I need to understand how I missed so much. That's fair, I said, but I'd like to get to know you properly if you're open to that. He turned to look at me. No pressure, no expectations, just honesty. Two people who've been through something terrible and came out the other side wanting to understand what real connection looks like. I thought about Mrs. Chen's words about not asking permission to exist, about the throne behind the pillar and choosing to sit in my own light. And I thought about how Daniel had stood by me even when it cost him how he'd helped me fight back without trying to control my story or make himself the hero of it. What if we start over? I said, not as people tied by a broken past, but as two people who finally know what honesty looks like. He smiled, and it was genuine and hopeful and uncomplicated. I'd like that very much. 3 months after the press conference, my life had settled into something I'd never experienced before. Peace, not the absence of problems, but the presence of genuine contentment. I worked my shifts at Portland General, came home to my apartment that now felt like a sanctuary rather than a hiding place, and spent evenings with people who actually wanted to be around me. Daniel and I had been dating slowly, carefully building something real on a foundation of honesty rather than desperation or deception. We'd gone to museums, cooked dinners together, taken long walks where we talked about our actual thoughts instead of performing versions of ourselves we thought the other wanted to see. I'd also started therapy, which Sarah had been gently suggesting for years. Dr. Amelia Patterson specialised in family trauma and scapegoating dynamics, and she'd helped me understand that healing wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about releasing the belief that I'd somehow caused or deserved the treatment I'd received. My father had been calling, not constantly, but regularly enough that I knew he was trying. I'd let the calls go to voicemail, listening to his increasingly desperate messages, asking to talk, to explain, to make amends. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. But on a grey November afternoon, when his name appeared on my screen for probably the 20th time, I finally answered. Megan. His voice broke on my name. Thank you for picking up. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, I said honestly. I was sitting in my apartment, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside me, rain pattering against the windows. I've divorced Linda. The papers were finalised last week. The house is empty now, just me. It's too quiet, too full of ghosts. He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. Megan, sweetheart, please come home. Let me make things right. Let me be the father I should have been from the beginning. Please give me a chance. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Part of me, the little girl who'd spent decades waiting for her father to choose her, to protect her, to love her the way he'd loved my mother, wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to believe that now finally everything could be different. Let me think about it, I heard myself say. I need some time. Of course, take all the time you need. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. After I hung up, I sat with the decision for days. Sarah came over one evening bringing Thai food and her usual direct approach to complicated situations. Maybe this is your chance for closure, she said, spooning pad Thai onto plates. He sounds genuine, Meg. Maybe he really has changed. Maybe, I said, but something didn't feel right about it, and I couldn't quite identify what. I talked to Dr. Patterson about it in our next session. What do you want from a relationship with your father? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. For so long I just wanted him to see me, to choose me, to acknowledge that what happened wasn't okay. And has he done that? He's apologised. He's divorced Linda. He's asking me to come back. But is he asking what you need? Or is he asking you to help him feel better about his guilt? Dr. Patterson's question sat heavy in the room. Megan, you've spent your entire life making yourself smaller so other people would be more comfortable. What would it look like if just this, once you chose yourself first? The answer came to me slowly over the following days, crystallising into certainty. On a Sunday morning, I called my father back. Daniel was at my apartment reading on the couch, giving me space, but staying close in case I needed support. Dad, I've thought about what you said, and His voice was so hopeful it hurt to hear. I spent 32 years waiting to hear you say what you said on that call, waiting for you to choose me over Linda, over your guilt, over your comfort. I waited through every forgotten birthday, every ignored achievement, every moment you stood silent while your wife and her sister tortured me. My voice was steady firm. But I don't need you to choose me anymore, because I've already chosen myself. Megan, please. I'm not coming back to that house, Dad. Not to prove I forgive you. Not to make you feel better about 30 years of cowardice. Not to play happy family and pretend everything's okay now that Linda's gone. I'm building my own life with people who loved me from the start. People who never needed to be convinced I was worth loving. The silence on the other end was heavy with his pain, and part of me wanted to take it back to comfort him the way I'd always done. But Dr. Patterson's words echoed. What would it look like if you chose yourself first? I'm not saying never. I continued, my voice softer but still firm. Maybe one day we can have coffee. Maybe one day we can talk and build something new. But I'm done waiting for you to see my worth, Dad. I see it now, and that's enough. I understand. His voice was thick with tears. I hurt you so badly, and I don't know how to fix it. You can't fix it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You can't go back and be the father I needed then. And I don't need that father anymore. I've learned to be okay without him. I took a breath. If you want to be in my life going forward, it has to be on new terms. Not me coming back to your world and pretending the past didn't happen. But maybe someday building something small and honest in the present. If you can respect that I get to decide the timeline and the boundaries. I can respect that, he said quietly. I'll wait, however long it takes. Don't wait, Dad. Live your life. Process your guilt. Go to therapy. Figure out who you are without Linda and without the daughter you failed to protect. And maybe when we're both ready, we'll see if there was something to build. I hung up before he could respond, before he could plead or promise or say anything else that might make me doubt the boundary I just set. Daniel looked up from his book, set it aside, and came to sit beside me on the couch. He took my hand, squeezed it gently. That took more courage than everything else combined, he said quietly. I leaned against him, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something that felt surprisingly light. I thought I'd feel guilty or sad or angry. What do you feel? Peace. And I realized it was true. For the first time in my life, I'd chosen my own well-being over someone else's comfort. And instead of the guilt I'd expected, I felt free. Free from the need for his approval. Free from the little girl who'd spent decades waiting for crumbs. Free to build a life where I didn't have to earn my place at every table. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. Hi, Megan. This is Mrs. Chen from the hospital. Remember me? I'm being discharged tomorrow. Would you be willing to visit me sometime? I'd love to hear how your story ended. Gloria Chen. I smiled, remembering the elderly woman who'd helped me see my worth when I couldn't see it myself. It didn't end, I texted back. It finally started. I'd love to visit you and tell you all about it. I visited Mrs. Chen the day after she was discharged, bringing flowers and the kind of Italian cookies she'd mentioned loving during one of our late-night conversations in the hospital. She lived in a small but tidy apartment in southeast Portland, and her face lit up when she opened the door. Over tea, I told her everything that had happened since that night she'd helped me see I wasn't the problem. She listened with the same wisdom and presence she'd shown in her hospital bed, and when I finished, she took my hand and said simply, "You found your throne." I did, I agreed. Thank you for helping me see it was there all along. Our visits became regular after that every other week, usually on Sunday afternoons. She became part of the small circle of people I was choosing to build my life around, people who saw me clearly and loved what they saw. Work had transformed too. I was still doing the same job, the same shifts, the same emergency room chaos, but it felt different now. It wasn't an escape anymore, somewhere to hide from a family that didn't want me. It was a calling, something I did because it mattered, and because I was good at it. During a staff meeting in late November, I'd suggested starting a support group for hospital employees dealing with family estrangement or toxic family dynamics. I'd expected maybe 3 or 4 people to show up. Instead, the first meeting drew 15 staff members, from nurses to janitors to administrative assistants, all carrying their own versions of being made invisible by the people who should have loved them most. We met every other Thursday evening, sharing stories and strategies, creating a chosen family within the walls of Portland General. One afternoon, in early December, I was reviewing patient charts at the nurses' station when Patricia approached me with an odd expression. "Megan, there's someone in the waiting room asking to see you. She says it's personal. Do you want me to tell her you're busy?" "Who is it?" Patricia hesitated. "Linda Davis, your stepmother." My first instinct was to say yes, tell her I was busy, avoid the confrontation entirely. But something in me had shifted over these past months. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. "I'll see her, just for a few minutes." Linda sat in the corner of the waiting room, and the change in her was startling. She'd always been immaculately put together, her appearance a carefully constructed armour. But the woman sitting there looked older, smaller, diminished. Her hair was grey at the roots, her clothes less polished, her makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She stood when she saw me clutching a small box. "Megan, thank you for seeing me. I know I don't deserve..." Her voice cracked. "I don't deserve anything from you." I didn't sit down, didn't invite her to relax. I just waited. "I've been in therapy," she said finally. "Real therapy, not the kind where you go to complain about your problems and have someone validate you. The kind where they make you look at the ugly truth about yourself." She looked down at the box in her hands. "My therapist asked me why I hated you, and I kept saying I didn't hate you, But she wouldn't let me hide behind that. She made me see that I did hate you, not for anything you did, but for what you represented." I still said nothing, just let her continue. "Your mother Sarah died 32 years ago, and I've spent every day since then competing with her memory, trying to make your father love me the way he loved her. But you looked so much like her. Every time I saw you, I saw proof that I'd never be enough." Tears were streaming down her face now. "You were a child, an innocent child who'd lost her mother, and instead of loving you the way I should have, I took my jealousy and insecurity out on you for 3 decades. There's no excuse for that. None." She held out the box. "This belonged to your grandmother, Sarah's mother. It was supposed to go to you after Sarah died, but I kept it. I told myself I was keeping it safe, but really I just couldn't stand the thought of you having one more piece of her." She opened the box, revealing a delicate silver locket. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything, but you deserved to have this." I took the box, opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photo I'd never seen, before my mother holding me as a baby, both of us laughing. The image was faded but clear enough to see the love in her eyes, the joy on her face. A physical connection to the mother I'd barely known, the proof that I'd been deeply loved before Linda had entered our lives. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said quietly. "Maybe I never will be. 30 years of cruelty doesn't get erased by one apology and one returned heirloom." "I know," Linda whispered. "But thank you for returning this. It does matter. It means something." I closed the locket, felt its weight in my palm. "I hope you find peace, Linda. I hope therapy helps you understand yourself, but I can't be part of that journey. I can't help you heal from the damage you caused me." She nodded, tears still falling, and turned to leave. I watched her walk out of the hospital, this woman who'd shaped so much of my pain, and felt nothing but a distant sadness for the broken person she'd been all along. That evening I fastened the locket around my neck, and for the first time I felt my mother's presence, not as a loss, but as a gift. I had her letters, her trust fund finally restored, and now this, a piece of jewellery she'd worn that her mother had worn, connecting me to a lineage of women who'd loved deeply and truly. The following weekend, Sarah organised a dinner party at her house. It was small, intimate, just the people who'd become my chosen family. Daniel was there, of course, and Mrs. Chen, who Sarah had picked up and would drive home later. 3 colleagues from the hospital who'd become real friends, a woman named Jennifer from my support group who'd become a confidant. We crowded around Sarah's dining table, passing dishes, family-style talking and laughing, without the careful politeness that marks gatherings of people who don't truly know each other. Mrs. Chen told stories about growing up in Taiwan. Daniel shared terrible jokes that made everyone groan and laugh simultaneously. Sarah kept refilling wine glasses and beaming at the scene she'd orchestrated, and I sat there surrounded by people who'd chosen to be in my life and who I'd chosen right back, and realised this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or performance or conditional love, but genuine connection and mutual care. To Megan, Mrs. Chen raised her glass. Who taught us all that the throne is wherever you decide to sit? Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt tears in my eyes for the first time in months, not from sadness or pain, but from overwhelming gratitude that I'd survived long enough to find this. As the evening wound down and people started gathering coats and saying goodbyes, Daniel walked me to my car. The December air was cold and crisp, and our breath made clouds in the streetlight. He pulled a simple, cream-coloured envelope from his jacket pocket. "I know we've been taking things slow," he said, nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. "And I'm glad we have been. It's been good getting to know you without all the trauma and chaos. But I'd like to take you to dinner. Somewhere nice. Just the 2 of us. No trauma, no drama, no shared tragedy. Just 2 people who actually like each other getting to know each other honestly." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a reservation confirmation for a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try months ago, something he'd clearly remembered. "What do you think?" he asked. I looked at this man who'd stood by me through the worst period of my life, who'd helped me fight back without trying to control my story, who'd given me space to heal without disappearing. And I thought about how different this felt from every other relationship I'd tried to build, while still carrying the weight of believing I wasn't enough. "I think," I said, smiling up at him, "that sounds perfect." The following Saturday evening, Daniel picked me up at 7. I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, changing 3 times before settling on a simple emerald green dress that Sarah had helped me pick out. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there in slacks and a button-down shirt, holding a single sunflower, my favourite, something I'd mentioned once in passing months ago. The fact that he'd remembered made my chest tight with something I was learning to recognise as hope. "You look beautiful," he said, and the way he said it, simple, honest, without performance, made me believe him. "So do you," I replied, then laughed. "I mean handsome. You look handsome." He grinned. "I'll take beautiful. Come on, I have something to show you." I'd assumed we were going to the restaurant he'd made reservations for, but instead he drove us to his house, a modest craftsman in inner southeast that I'd only seen once before. "Change of plans," he explained as we pulled into the driveway. I realised I didn't want to have this conversation in a crowded restaurant where we'd have to perform for strangers. I wanted it to be just us. No audience, no performance. So I cooked dinner, or attempted to cook dinner. Fair warning, I may have overestimated my abilities. Inside his dining room table was set simply but thoughtfully. Candles, cloth napkins, a bottle of wine already open and breathing. Soft music played from a speaker somewhere, nothing intrusive, just gentle background. The whole scene felt intimate without being overwhelming romantic, without being presumptuous. "This is perfect," I said and meant it. Daniel pulled out my chair, then disappeared into the kitchen, returning with plates of pasta in what looked like marinara sauce. "It's nothing fancy, just spaghetti and sauce I made from scratch, or tried to. I think I overcooked the pasta a bit and the sauce might be too acidic because I got nervous about the recipe. I took a bite. The pasta was indeed slightly overcooked and the sauce was a touch acidic, but it was made with care and intention, and that mattered more than culinary perfection. "It's delicious," I said honestly. "Thank you for doing this." We ate slowly, the conversation flowing easily. At first, work stories, funny things Mrs. Chen had said during our last visit, a book Daniel was reading. But as we finished eating and moved to his living room with wine glasses in hand, the conversation shifted to something deeper. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said, sitting on the couch with careful space between us. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Emma, about how I almost married someone I didn't know at all, because I was in love with who I thought she was rather than who she actually was. I built this whole fantasy of a relationship based on gratitude and her performance of being my saviour, and I never questioned it because I wanted it to be true." He looked at me, his expression vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. "I don't want to make that mistake again. I don't want to fall in love with who I think you are or who I need you to be. I want to know the real you, flaws and fears and all of it, even if it takes years, especially if it takes years." I set down my wine glass, feeling my own vulnerability rising to meet his. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "I'm terrified of trusting someone and ending up invisible again, of making myself smaller and smaller, trying to earn love that should never have to be earned. I've spent my entire life believing I wasn't enough, and even though I know intellectually now that wasn't true, that belief is still there. It's like a reflex I can't quite shake." "What does that fear look like in practice?" Daniel asked gently. "It looks like me not saying what I really want because I'm afraid you'll think I'm too demanding. It looks like me accepting less than I deserve because I'm grateful someone wants me at all. It looks like me apologising for existing." I twisted my hands together. "I'm working on it in therapy, but I'm not fixed. I'm still learning how to take up space without apologising for it." Daniel moved closer, not touching me yet, but closing the physical distance between us. "Megan, I don't need perfect. I don't need fixed. I just need honest. I need to know that when something bothers you, you'll tell me. That when you're happy, I'll know it's real and not just you performing contentment because you think that's what I want to see." He took my hand and I felt the warmth of his palm against mine. "You saved my life twice. Once on that highway when you stopped and pulled me out of that wreck, and once by showing me what real integrity looks like. What it looks like to stand up for the truth, even when it costs you everything. You're the most genuine person I've ever met, and I don't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are." I felt tears building, but I didn't fight them. What if who I am is still figuring out who I am? I spent so many years being what other people needed me to be that I'm not even sure what I want or need sometimes. "Then we'll figure it out together," Daniel said simply. "No rushing, no pressure, no grand gestures or sweeping declarations. We'll date properly. Movies and walks and coffee and conversations where we learn each other slowly. And if at any point you need space or time or anything else, you tell me. And I'll trust that you're being honest about what you need. What if I mess up? What if I fall back into old patterns? Then we talk about it. We adjust. We're both learning how to do this, how to build something real instead of something based on trauma or fantasy or performance." He squeezed my hand gently. "I like you, Megan. I like talking to you. I like how you care about your patients and your friends. I like that you laugh at terrible jokes and that you wear your mother's locket every day now, and that you're brave enough to build a life that's actually yours. I want to see where this goes, but only if we can do it honestly." I looked at this man who'd stood beside me through the worst period of my life, who'd helped me fight without trying to take over my fight, who was now offering me something I'd never had before, a relationship where I could be myself, still healing, still figuring things out, and be valued exactly as I was. "I'd like that too," I said softly. "The honest part, the slow part, The figuring it out together part, all of it. Daniel smiled, and it was warm and genuine and uncomplicated. Good. Then let's start there. We talked for hours more about everything and nothing. He told me about his childhood, about losing his mother to breast cancer when he was 15, about building his business from nothing. I told him about my mother's letters, about the little moments of joy I'd held on to during the hard years, about my dreams of maybe eventually owning a small house with a garden. The conversation flowed without effort, without performance, without the careful calculation of what was safe to reveal. When he finally drove me home close to midnight, the Portland streets were quiet and empty. He walked me to my apartment door, and I found myself not wanting the evening to end. "Thank you," I said, turning to face him, "for seeing me, for believing me, for not asking me to be anyone other than who I am." Daniel smiled, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "That's the easiest thing in the world." He leaned in slowly, giving me time to pull back if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. His kiss was gentle, unhurried, a promise rather than a demand. When we pulled apart, I felt grounded and present in a way I'd never experienced before. "Good night, Megan," he said softly. "Good night." I watched him walk back to his car, waited until he drove away, then turned to unlock my door. That's when I saw it, a cream-coloured envelope on my doormat, slightly damp from the evening mist. I picked it up, my stomach clenching when I saw the return address, Boise, Idaho. Emma's handwriting on the front. I stood there in my doorway holding the envelope, feeling the weight of the evening with Daniel still warm in my chest while facing this ghost from a past I'd worked so hard to move beyond. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened. But another part, the part that had learnt the hard way, that avoiding truth only gave it more power, knew I needed to read whatever was inside. I carried the envelope inside, set it on my kitchen counter, and made myself a cup of tea before I opened it. I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, steam rising from my tea, and stared at Emma's handwriting for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread to maintain the boundary I'd worked so hard to establish. But another part, the part that had learned that avoiding truth only gave it more power, knew I needed to see what was inside. I texted Daniel. "Emma sent a letter. Long one. I'm okay, but if you're not too far, would you mind coming back?" His response came immediately. "Turning around now. Be there in 10. While I waited, I made a second cup of tea and tried to prepare myself for whatever I was about to read. When Daniel knocked softly, I let him in without a word. He didn't ask questions, just sat beside me at the table, his presence solid and reassuring. "Do you want me to read it first?" he offered. "I can tell you what's in it, and you can decide if you want to see it yourself." I shook my head. "No, I need to do this. But thank you for being here." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 10 pages of handwriting, Emma's usually neat script, now looser, more hurried, as if the words had poured out of her faster than she could organise them. The first page was dated 2 weeks ago from Clearwater Residential Treatment Center in Boise, Idaho. "Dear Megan," it began. "I'm writing this from a place I never thought I'd end up. After everything fell apart, after I lost my job and my apartment and every friend I thought I had a breakdown. A real one, not the performed kind I'd accused you of having. I ended up in the emergency room, and from there a social worker convinced me to come here, a residential facility that specialises in personality disorders and intensive trauma therapy. I've been here for 3 months now. This is my 3rd attempt at writing this letter. The first 2, my therapist said I was still making excuses, still trying to be the victim, so I'm trying again, and this time I'm going to just tell the truth." I took a sip of tea, my hands already shaking. Daniel reached over and squeezed my free hand, grounding me. "In my first therapy session," Emma's letter continued, "Dr. Ramirez asked me a question I wasn't expecting. When did you first realise your mother didn't love you?" I got angry. I said she did love me, that I was her daughter, that Mum had always chosen me over you. But Dr. Ramirez wouldn't let it go. She made me think about it, really think about it. And I remembered something I'd buried for years. The handwriting got messier, as if Emma's hand had been shaking while she wrote. I was 7 years old. There was an art competition at school and I won first place. I was so proud. I drew our family, Dad, Mum, me and you. I put you in the picture because even though Mum said I shouldn't talk about you, I missed you. You were my sister and I didn't understand why we couldn't be a real family. I brought the drawing home so excited to show Mum. She looked at it and her face went cold. Then she grabbed the drawing and slapped it out of my hand so hard the paper tore. She said, "If you loved me, you'd forget her, just like your father should have forgotten that woman." I felt my chest tighten, imagining 7-year-old Emma trying to understand why her mother was angry about an innocent drawing. That's when I understood, Emma wrote. The only way to earn Mum's love was to erase you, to pretend you didn't exist, to be better than you in every way, so she'd finally look at me the way Dad looked at you on the rare occasions he thought no one was watching. I spent my whole life trying to destroy you, thinking if you disappeared completely, there'd finally be room for me in Mum's heart. The next page started with a single sentence that made me close my eyes. But Dr. Ramirez helped me see something I'd never wanted to admit. Mum never loved me either. She loved the idea of replacing Sarah, Emma continued. She loved having a daughter who wasn't a constant reminder of Dad's first wife. But she didn't love me, Emma, the actual person. I was just a tool she used to hurt you and to try to make Dad forget. When I understood that, when I really let myself feel it, I fell apart because I'd spent 30 years destroying you for someone who never actually loved either of us. I could feel tears running down my face now, but I kept reading. Daniel handed me a tissue without a word. I need you to know none of this was your fault. Emma wrote, her handwriting steadier now. You were kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. You included me in things. You helped me with homework. You tried to be a sister to me, and I repaid that kindness with decades of cruelty. I stole your inheritance. I forged documents to make you look mentally ill. I took credit for saving Daniel's life. I tried to have you institutionalized to silence you. I made your wedding day a public humiliation. And through it all, you kept trying to be good, kept trying to help people, kept trying to survive. The next section was titled Accountability in capital letters. Under it, Emma had listed every cruel thing she'd done with dates where she could remember them. The stolen trust fund, the credit card fraud, the fake psychiatric records, taking credit for saving Daniel, the restraining order, the attempted involuntary commitment. Each item was followed by, "This was wrong. I did this. I take full responsibility." I've agreed to pay full restitution, she wrote, every cent of the trust fund plus interest and damages. I've surrendered what little I had left in savings. I'm starting over from nothing, which is what you had to do because of me. It doesn't make to us even nothing could make us even, but it's what I can do. The letter's tone shifted in the final pages, becoming quieter, more reflective. My therapist says I need to understand why I did these things, not to excuse them, but to make sure I never become that person again. We're working on it. I'm learning that I confused love with competition, that I built my entire identity around being better than Megan, because I had no idea who I was without you to define myself against. I'm 30 years old, and I'm just now learning how to be a person, how to have relationships that aren't transactional, how to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of destroying other people to make myself feel bigger. She described her days at the facility group therapy, individual sessions learning basic coping skills she should have learned decades ago. She talked about another patient who'd reminded her of me and how she'd initially hated the woman before realizing the hatred was really directed at herself. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Emma wrote near the end. I don't deserve it, and I'm not entitled to your emotional labor of absolving me. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything. You were right that Mum was cruel. You were right that I was jealous. You were right that the family was toxic. And you were right to fight back, even though it cost you everything for a while. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. You were always the stronger one, Megan, the better one, the one who stayed kind when the world gave you every reason to become bitter. I'm sorry it took me 30 years and losing everything to see that. I'm sorry I can't give you back the childhood you deserved or the family that should have loved you. All I can say is, you won. Not because you destroyed me, but because you became yourself despite everything we did to stop you. I hope your life is good now. I hope you're surrounded by people who see what I was too broken to see. You deserve that. You always did. It was signed simply Emma, with no additional sentiment or plea for response. I sat there in silence, holding the letter, feeling Daniel's presence beside me, but not needing him to say anything. The letter had been more honest than I'd expected, more self-aware, more truly remorseful. It didn't erase what Emma had done, but it at least proved she was finally looking at the truth, instead of running from it. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? Daniel asked softly after a long silence. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it in my kitchen drawer, rather than throwing it away. Maybe, I said honestly. But first, I need to finish forgiving myself for all the years I believed their lies about who I was. For all the years I made myself small and apologized for existing, and thought their cruelty was somehow my fault. I turned to look at Daniel, and I could see in his eyes that he understood. I'm not there yet, I continued, but I think I'm on my way, and maybe that's enough for now. He pulled me into a hug, and I let myself lean into him, let myself accept the comfort without wondering if I'd have to pay for it later. This was what healing looked like, I realized. Not a dramatic moment of forgiveness and reconciliation, but the slow, steady work of building a life where the past had less and less power over the present. Do you want to talk about it more? Daniel asked, or would you rather do something completely different? I thought about it then, smiled. Something completely different. Let's watch a movie, something funny, something that has nothing to do with family trauma or complicated feelings. I have just the thing, Daniel said, pulling out his phone to scroll through streaming options. Terrible comedy from the 90s, the kind that's so bad, it's good. Perfect. And it was. Because healing wasn't just about processing pain, it was also about creating moments of lightness, of choosing joy, of building a life where not everything had to be heavy and meaningful. It was about being able to read a letter from the sister who'd tormented me for decades, feel the complexity of that, and then choose to spend the rest of the evening laughing at a ridiculous movie with someone who cared about me. That night, as I got ready for bed, I touched my mother's locket and thought about the woman who'd loved me enough to try to protect me even after death. And I thought about Mrs. Chen's words, stop asking for permission to exist. I was done asking permission. I was done waiting for forgiveness from people who'd never earned the right to grant it. I was building a life on my own terms, and that finally, after 37 years, felt like coming home. 1 year after I sat behind a pillar at my sister's wedding, I stood on a beach at sunset preparing to marry the man who'd helped me reclaim my voice. The ceremony was everything Emma's had not been, small, intimate, real. 40 people gathered in a semicircle on the sand chairs arranged. So there was no front row or back row, no hierarchy of importance. Everyone who came was there because we'd chosen each other, because love had been freely given and freely received. I'd sent 2 invitations that had required the most thought. The first went to my father, who'd been slowly rebuilding his life in therapy, learning to live with the guilt of his decades of silence. He accepted immediately, and I could see him now sitting toward the back, his face lined with age and regret, but also something that looked like cautious hope. The second invitation went to Emma in Idaho. She'd sent back a card with a simple message. I'm not ready yet, but I'm so happy for you. You deserve every bit of joy. Maybe someday I'll be healthy enough to celebrate it with you in person. Congratulations, Megan. I'd placed one empty chair in the centre front of our semicircle. On it sat a framed photo of my mother Sarah young and radiant holding baby me. She should be here. I'd explained to the officiant, and everyone understood. The late afternoon sun flooded the beach, casting everything in golden light. No shadows, no pillars, no hidden corners. When the officiant asked if I wanted to say anything before we exchanged vows, I turned to face our guests. A year ago, I sat behind a pillar at a wedding, hidden and humiliated. I was told I should be grateful just to be there. Today, I stand in the light surrounded by people who love me, not because I earned it, but because love isn't something you earn. It's something you're worthy of from the moment you're born. I saw Mrs. Chen in the third row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Sarah stood beside her beaming. My colleagues from the hospital, the members of my support group, the friends I'd chosen, all of them looking at me with genuine affection. To anyone who's ever felt invisible. I continued, "You're not. You never were. You just needed to find your own light. And sometimes that means walking away from people who only feel bright when you're in shadow." Daniel squeezed my hand, and we exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. Promises about honesty, about growth, about building a life where we could both be fully ourselves. When he kissed me as the sun touched the horizon, I felt complete in a way I'd never imagined possible. 2 years after that wedding, I was working a night shift when Mrs. Chen came in for a routine checkup. At 86, now she moved more slowly, but her mind was as sharp as ever. While checking her vitals, she asked me to tell her the whole story one more time. She loved hearing how things had turned out. When I finished, she asked the question I knew was coming. "What about your sister? Did you ever reconcile?" I paused, considering my answer carefully. "She sent me a letter last month. She's been out of the residential facility for over a year now. She's working as a barista in Boise, living simply attending AA meetings regularly. She said she's been sober for 18 months. She asked if we could meet for coffee sometime." "And what did you say?" I said, "Maybe next year, that I'm not ready yet." I finished adjusting her IV and met her wise eyes. "But I think someday I might be. Not because I owe her anything, but because I've healed enough that seeing her won't threaten the peace I've built. That feels like victory, too." Mrs. Chen smiled. "You found your throne." I did, and I learned it was never behind any pillar, it was always right here. I touched my chest over my heart. When my shift ended and I walked out to the parking lot, soft rain was beginning to fall. Daniel was waiting by my car with an umbrella, just as he'd been waiting in the rain that terrible day at the church when everything had begun to change. But this rain felt different, cleansing rather than cold. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Always." I said and meant it. As we walked to the car together, equal partners in every way that mattered, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. Some wounds heal not because the people who caused them change, but because we choose to stop carrying them. I'd learned that I didn't need to earn my place in my own story, didn't need permission to exist or approval to take up space, or forgiveness to move forward. The throne was never behind the pillar. It was always within me. I just had to learn to see it, claim it, and sit in my own light without apologizing for shining. And me, I finally learned the most important lesson of all. I was never the problem. I was just waiting for the right moment to step into my own light. Tomorrow, I'd return to Portland General to save more lives, to run my support group, to keep building the life I'd chosen. But tonight, I walked through the gentle rain with someone who loved me for exactly who I was, and that felt like the truest happy ending I could have ever imagined. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally, completely, authentically myself. And that was more than enough. If Megan's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or been made to feel like you should be grateful just to be included, I want you to know something important. You are not alone. Thousands of people have watched this story and seen themselves in Megan's journey. The comments section has become a community of survivors, supporters, and people who finally feel seen. So here's what I'm asking you to do. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you stories like this, Stories about people who refused to stay silent, who chose themselves, who found their throne, even when the world tried to keep them behind the pillar. These aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you deserve better, that your voice matters, that healing is possible. Second, and this is the most important part, tell me your story in the comments. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? Have you had to set boundaries with people who should have loved you unconditionally? What was your throne behind the pillar moment? And how did you reclaim your light? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. It might be the thing that gives another person the courage to choose themselves. And if this story helped you see something differently about your own life, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Tag a friend who's been made to feel invisible. Send it to someone who's struggling to set boundaries. Let's create a community where nobody has to sit behind the pillar anymore. Remember what Mrs. Chen said, stop asking for permission to exist. You were born worthy. Now go out there and claim your throne. I'll see you in the next story.